Chapter 1914. Published at 8th of June 2023 9:47 and 13 seconds AM. Chapter 1914. Waves. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Alejandro Morales sat in silence. Compared to the brewing rage he had had 3 months ago, he was currently the picture of perfect calm. He sat at the very top of a pillar that was at least 100 kilometers tall. All around him, there were similar pillars, but even the tallest one of them was only 80 kilometers tall. Although Alejandro didn't say anything, an invisible barrier surrounded him. It was clear that no one else was welcome to sit on his pillar. If one wanted to participate in this gathering, they would have to fight for the lesser pillars. The dignity of the Morales wasn't something a mere few loud voices could infringe upon. One after another, powerhouses appeared around planet Morales. With their sharp eyesights, even from so far above, they could see this setup completely. Many of their expressions darkened, but there was little that they could do. They had already pushed the Morales to this point. It was impossible to ask for more at this point. One at a time, the organizations and families that had chosen to participate sent forward one representative each. They descended from the skies with dignity and arrogance between their brows, each one very much used to ruling over trillions. They all represented the very pinnacle of the seventh dimensional and were existences that functioned as the backbone of the human domain. One of the first was an older woman wearing fluttering green robes. Despite the dignity between her brows, she still had some of the tender lines of youthful beauty that had aged akin to fine wine on her features. She was Inabella, a powerhouse of the Tier 9 seventh dimension, and a current pillar of the Biyao family which Lionel had quite some contentious interactions with in the Void Palace. The fact that she wasn't the matriarch of her family, but rather an elder with even higher status than that, spoke volumes. She was considered to be an ancestor of her family, but she had no choice but to greet someone who was technically her junior and Alejandro as though they were equals. But the unfortunate truth was that in this situation, they were. The moment she entered the region of the pillars that pierced the skies like spears, her flight wavered and she nearly fell from the skies. She teetered, clenching her jaw in silence as she tried to maintain her steady flight, taking a breath and walking through the air with her best feigned attempt. From start to finish, Alejandro never opened his eyes even a single time. After a while of struggling, Inabella finally managed to land on a pillar that was 60 kilometers tall, landing stably. Although she looked up toward Alejandro with a hint of coldness in her eyes, she didn't say anything as she sat and crossed her legs and began to recuperate. Those that were waiting on the outside watched this with solemn expressions. Inabella was quite famous in her day and she had also been a domain-ranked disciple of the Void Palace. And yet, she had only been able to claim a 60-kilometer tall pillar. The worst part was that the lowest pillar there stood at 50 kilometers tall. In this context, 10 kilometers was too small of a gap. Those families that were substantially weaker than the Biyao family had on especially ugly expressions. If even the Biyao family was like this, what chance did they stand? They realized that riding the wave to condemn the Morales family wouldn't be as easy as they thought it would be in the beginning. Numbers were quite useless in the face of absolute strength. After some hesitation, dozens of families chose to withdraw while some became even more selective with who they sent forward. Soon, a new batch came forward. They were much more prepared for the sudden pressure in comparison to Inabella, but even so, their performance wasn't much better. In fact, not a single one managed to reach the 60-kilometer pillars, all of them accumulating along the most numerous 50-kilometer pillars. In fact, some of them still overestimated themselves, falling to the ground below red-faced and embarrassed. While none of the failures died, they had no choice but to walk at the pace of a mortal to leave the area of the suppression, only to become the scrutiny of everyone above. Witnessing others being embarrassed to such an extent only made others less and less likely to participate. It took a very long while before the next 60-kilometer pillar was filled, this time by an older man. This was a gentleman that would be very familiar to Lionel. He was an elder of the Thrusting Skies sector, Malstar Skies. However, to everyone's shock, Malstar's toes only tapped the 60-kilometer pillar for a split second, being he pierced forward like a streaking arc of lightning, appearing on a 70-kilometer pillar and exhaling a slight breath. Inabella's eyes snapped open and her pupils constricted. Mao Star and her should have been on the same level. How could he possibly land on a pillar higher than herself? Although he had used a lower pillar for leverage, Inabella had experienced that pressure herself. If it was so easy, she would have done it herself. The only explanation was that Mao Star was stronger than her now, at least in movement technique. Mao Star didn't seem to notice the expressions of everyone else, landing on the pillar with a calm expression and sitting in silence. Inabella frowned, but she could do nothing. Trying to reach the 70-kilometer pillar now, and likely failing, would only make her lose face. She had no choice but to swallow this. There were enough that had failed that while Mao Star's performance was shocking, it wasn't enough for attention to be turned to her inadequacies. As for Alejandro, he likewise said nothing, not even opening his eyes. There weren't any rules. If you could figure out a loophole, more power to you. He couldn't be bothered to give a damn. At that moment, several powerful pressures came from above, new groups descending in waves. Chapter 1915. Published at 8th of June 2023 9:47 and 11 seconds AM. Chapter 1915. Silence if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. The vast majority that descended could only take up 50-kilometer tall pillars. However, as time passed, more and more powerful existences began to make their presences known. After Inabella, a group of organizations appeared swiftly, all three of which were actually prominent religions taking their place on the 60-kilometer pillars. There was the evergreen religion, the Zoltene faith, and the final was the third largest religion of the human domain, the Star faith. The Star faith was quite mysterious in that they didn't worship a person, but rather a force. Their belief was that the most fundamental force in existence was Star Force, acting as the foundation of all things. Unsurprisingly, their people tended to have exceptional Star Force affinity, as this was believed by them to make these individuals the harbingers of the universe's will. The numbers of the 60-kilometer pillars were swiftly filled, much like the 50-kilometer pillars before them. And then, slowly but surely, powerhouses that could occupy the 70-kilometer pillars began to appear one after another. Smaller families of the constellation Biyao alliance fell into this category. The Hawk family, the Hood family, the Elven family. Not far behind them were the families that upheld the spearmanship. These were the families that mostly made up the stalwart polearm party. Among this number, there were quite a few that preferred weapons like the glaive and halberd as well. The Croft family, the Sterling family, the Diablo family. At that moment, the howl of a sword echoed over the horizon. The sudden change caused many that were focused on reaching their target pillars to waver slightly, the strong surge causing their pupils to constrict. At first, many assumed that the Suyard family was making the appearance, but after some thought, they felt that it was simply impossible. There was no way that the Suyard family would allow the Morales family to casually change the narrative. If they were going to appear, their current attempt would be far more forceful than just this. The Sina family. An older gentleman with long, fluttering eyebrows appeared over the horizon. He cut through the air like a sword, a formation of blades hovering around him as he sliced through the pressure as though it was nothing more than a thin wind. Bang! He landed heavily on an 80-kilometer pillar, his sharp, sword-like gaze landing on Alejandro, who continued to sit unmoved on the 100-kilometer pillar. There weren't even any 90-kilometer pillars to make use of. This was already the furthest he could go unless he was willing to battle it out with Alejandro. The Morales had clearly done this on purpose, making it so that 80 kilometers was the highest would diminish the prestige of all the highest-level families. The Suyard family was definitely on a far higher level than his Sina family, but wouldn't they have to obediently pick out an 80-kilometer pillar? The older man sneered, his aura flourishing. However, he did nothing and he remained silent. He felt that it was beneath him to speak to a junior like Alejandro. In his youth, he was collectively known as the Twin Swords along with a current ancestor of the Suyard family. That ancestor was known as the Light Sword and he was known as the Shadow Sword, both literally and figuratively. The relationship of the Sina and Suyard families weren't exactly like master and subordinate and was much more complex than that, but even setting such a thing aside, just his status alone was far beyond just pettiness. After releasing his aura to make his displeasure known, he said nothing else and sat in meditation. He wondered if Alejandro would be able to remain so nonchalant in a few more moments. The appearance of the shadow sword seemed to have unleashed an avalanche onto Morales territory. One after another, the constellation families began to appear one after another, each one carving paths toward the 80-kilometer pillars. The Gamin family, the Libra family, the Tor family, the Tarius family, the Pius family, the Cornus family, the Cancer family, the Ram family, the Virgo family, the Aquarius family, the Pisc family, the Leo family. The uproarious laughter of Vanuzzi Leo echoed through the skies, dispersing the clouds and causing the narrow pillars to sway from side to side. Many of the weaker existences were forced to grit their teeth and unleash their force to forcefully stabilize themselves. Behind the constellation families came the number one religion of the human domain. Their representative was a young woman with thick and large sleeves that hid her hands in a clasp of prayer. A halo hung above her head and it seemed very much real. It didn't seem to be a gimmick or even something forcefully created by force. Even if it was, she was simply too beautiful for others to lambast. This young woman was known as a demi-goddess to their religion, a young woman with spiritual blood running through her veins. This was the spiritual faith, the strongest religion of the human domain and one that worshipped not a person, nor a force, but rather an entire race. This was a religion of people who believed that the spirituals were elevated humans and that only by seeking their guidance and cleansing oneself could you transcend humanity and become a spiritual as well. If the strongest factions of the human domain were to be listed, there was no doubt that the spiritual faith would be among them, although they were often neglected. The Morales, the Suyards, the Constellation Alliance, the Guild Alliance, Shield Cross Stars, the Void Palace, and finally, the spiritual faith. Of these powerhouses, 3 had arrived. But in keeping with the humble nature necessitated by her religion, the demi-goddess didn't fight for a higher place, simply gliding to a position on an 80-kilometer pillar. At that moment, though, the situation seemed that it was finally about to change. An unexpected ship appeared over the horizon and an even more unexpected person stepped out. The young woman was gorgeous beyond words and perfect beyond description. Cynthia Oman, the scorned Queen Beauty, stepped through the air, fluttering down with gentle steps. The entire world seemed to fall into silence. Chapter 1916. Published at 8th of June 2023 9:46 and 49 seconds AM. Chapter 1916. Go if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Cynthia fluttered down like a fairy, her presence among the only ones that could match and even faintly suppress the demi-goddess. Even with her age, it was impossible to find a single flaw, and even with her somewhat negative title of scorned Queen Beauty, not a single soul thought less of her. However, it was unknown if this was because she was simply that perfect, or if it was because the man who had tainted her reputation was so entirely irreproachable. The story of the scorned Queen Beauty was one that had set the human domain ablaze all those years ago. Velasco had ruined his fair share of beauties in his youth, and had infuriated even more families and organizations as a result. Whether it was the backing of the beauties themselves, or the backing of the young men who had lost the race for her, it could be said that he had enemies everywhere. If it wasn't for his absolute strength, even the Morales family would simply be unable to protect him. Even so, compared to all the others, the scorned Queen Beauty was an especially tragic one. If there was any female counterpart to Velasco, it was Cynthia Oman. She was unmatched by all except Velasco. Even the likes of Montez couldn't last more than a handful of exchanges with her. Ever since they were born and grew old enough to walk, most were entirely unable to mention Velasco without mentioning Cynthia. Even when Velasco ruined his first segment of beauties, no one batted an eye, assuming that he would end up with the pure and perfect Cynthia in the end regardless. Some were enraged with Velasco for forcing Cynthia to deal with such humiliating rumors about her future husband's lack of discipline, and no small number of battles had been triggered as a result of this. Even so, Cynthia had never said anything about it, silently waiting. And then, that day seemed to have come. Everything was prepared, the perfectly matched couple would finally come together. But it never happened. Before the wedding was meant to take place, Ishmael Morales died. What happened in between is unknown, but by the next time others heard of Velasco's wife, that title was no longer attached to Cynthia, but was rather attached to an unknown and somewhat ordinary genius of the Void Palace, an inconspicuous young woman from a sixth-dimensional family, Alienor. The human domain entered a state of uproar and the title of Scorned Queen Beauty was born. Seeing her fluttering down now, though, no one thought that this was a tragic beauty. This was a woman half the powerhouses of the human domain wanted, a beauty that most didn't even dare to have such thoughts of. Cynthia's body came to a pause in the air, her lovely blue eyes scanning the region for a moment. Her expression didn't seem to give anything away, and despite the fact she was already within the range of the suppression, her body didn't so much as sway. If it was not for the fact her robes clung to her curves just the slightest hint more, it would have been impossible to guess that she had entered range at all. Suddenly, Cynthia extended a slender finger and tapped at the air. Whoosh! Alejandro's eyes snapped open instantly, but it was already too late. A complex formation that had once been invisible suddenly appeared before the eyes of everyone. Cynthia pressed a finger down and touched a rune. At that moment, all iterations of that rune shone with a bright light, shimmering like miniature suns. A surging aura rose from Cynthia's lithe body, causing harsh winds to pick up. Those still sitting on their pillars and even many spaceships hovering around planet Morales trembled. Countless faces paled and even Alejandro's brows shot up. This wasn't the aura of a seventh-dimensional expert. She had already entered the eighth dimension. Cynthia dragged her finger across, shifting the position of the runes ever so slightly. Bang! The formation crumbled, bursting into a rain of shards of light. In that instant, the pressure everyone had been experiencing vanished. Cynthia floated forward through the shards as though she hadn't done a thing, landing on an 80-kilometer pillar without a word and taking a seat. Alejandro's lip couldn't help but twitch. She could have taken an 80-kilometer pillar just as easily with or without destroying the pressurizing formation, and yet she had chosen this path anyway. The wrath and pettiness of a scorned woman knew no bounds, and Alejandro knew better than to say anything. Even Vanuzzi Leo, who would usually be laughing at the Morales family's misfortune at this point, didn't dare to say a single thing. Alejandro exhaled a breath, and here he thought that the only one of that generation who could have possibly reached that level already was Velasco. It seems that it was not a coincidence that they're always attached at the hip in their youth. Shaking his head, Alejandro smiled bitterly inwardly. What happened next would be far more annoying because of the actions of this scorned beauty. Almost as though on cue. Boom! A warship double the size of a planet appeared over the horizon. On the bow of the ship, several white-robed fingers stood, the echo of sword howls sweeping over planet Morales. Boom! Another warship, just as large and just as looming, appeared. On the bow, men and women with bows striped across their chests stood in silence, the howl of bow force echoing over the planet. Go! Two young men glided forward. Compared to the others present, they're clearly out of place and were without a doubt members of Lionel's generation. The bow deity, Nazag Terius. The sword deity, Amory Suyard. The goal of the Terius and Suyard families was clear and obvious, and Cynthia's actions had allowed it to happen. The Morales had sent forward a junior that was young than 99% of those there, so they would send a pair even younger than that. Not only would this clearly knock the Morales down a pair, it would make their attempt to protect Lionel feel far more glaring than it should have. Chapter 1917. Published at 8th of June 2023 9:46 and 38 seconds AM. Chapter 1917. Real if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The two young men seemed to ride a wave of weapon force, landing on their pillars with a bang. Despite the seniority of those around them, their visages were the picture of indifference. It was clear at a glance why they were chosen to carry the future of their families. Alejandro didn't bother to close his eyes once again, and he had long since regained his composure. He angled his head to the skies, seemingly waiting to see if anyone else would appear. This was unlikely, whether it was the Void Palace or Shield Cross Stars. They were both committed to neutrality, and everyone else of note was already present. Plus, the Void Palace wasn't made up of families and organizations like this, while Shield Cross Stars, although they were, we're very invested in not placing any sort of nepotism front and center for obvious reasons. It seems like everyone is here, Alejandro said lightly. Although his voice was soft, it easily traveled to everyone. The purpose of this gathering is to discuss the finalized rules of the air wars, however. Alejandro's gaze flashed with lightning, the clouds above darkening. The Morales family and I, as their patriarch, would like to make something very clear first. First, Earth has never been our target. The secrets of the Morales family are beyond your understanding, and if you think that the hot blood that runs through our veins is capable of taking advantage of a fledgling world which is yet to be capable of standing on its own 2 feet. Crack. Boom. Arcs of lightning flashed across the skies, a suffocating boom echoing through all their hearts and pressing down on their hearts. Then you're assigning too much of your inferiority toward us. Alejandro's gaze flashed like lightning. Second, the Morales family and I don't give a damn whether you believe us or not. We have never needed your acknowledgement, nor will we ever need it. If you think you've forced our hand by causing this change in the air wars, you're nothing short of mistaken, and in the worst case, foolish. We do not need subliminal messaging, nor do you need to read between the lines with us. There is one and only one reason for these air wars. And that's as a reminder to you all that the dignity of the Morales family cannot be infringed upon. For the sake of the human domain and the dangers that it is facing, we've decided to keep this small reminder on a stage the younger generation can claim, but this is the one and final warning we will give you all. If you insist on pressing forward, thinking that numbers will oppress us and force us to take a step back, we will see what happens first. Whether the Morales will destroy the human domain first, or if outsiders will. Feel free to take your pick, and while you're at it, be sure to understand your limits. The crackle of thunder continued to echo and Alejandro's voice had gone from a light whisper to a booming cadence. Those from lesser families couldn't help but pale considerably. They had always heard that the Morales were a group of madmen, but never had they expected that they would rather war against the whole human domain than lower their heads. This was the final line the Morales were drawing, there wouldn't be a second. Alejandro grinned a malevolent grin, suddenly unable to control his true self. The pressure of so many families sitting around him made his blood boil, his spear force threatening to rage out of control. Even an 8th-dimensional expert had appeared, how could his blood not be alive? If it's up to me, I hope you don't know what's good for you. My blade has been sheathed for too long. At that moment, a figure rose up from the ground, landing by Alejandro with a light cough and patting his shoulder. Adderworth smiled lightly. Sorry, everyone, my father's temper has been the best recently. His words are correct, though, it's best that we keep this to the younger generation, the patience of the older is much more limited. Adderworth swept a gaze across everyone present. Truthfully, those words were the main reason we invited you all here. The Morales truly do not fear anyone and we do not change our plans for the sake of the pressure of outsiders. I, as the eldest brother of the Nova generation, speak for my brothers when I say whether you all participate or not, makes little to no difference. Our real competition was ourselves to begin with. The rules of the gathering will be the same as it always has been and you all can experience what every generation of Morales has experienced. If you do not like the rules, feel free to complain, though those complaints will likely fall of deaf ears. If there's nothing else, I will go about explaining what these rules are. After I am finished, we'll construct an official list of participants that cannot and will not be changed after we all leave here today. Anything? Adderworth seemed to gain the initiative back for the Morales family. At this point, if anyone asked for rule changes, it would seem as though they're asking for leniency compared to what the Morales family juniors usually experienced and they would only end up humiliating themselves. But at the same time, if the Morales family's rules weren't strict enough to begin with, then exposing these rules after so much bloviating now would only give rise to them to smack their own faces. At this point, everyone had to put their best foot forward with failure costing them endless humiliation. Adderworth's smile, though, seemed to make it clear that he was quite confident in this regard. Good. Then I'll begin to explain now. As always, the Morales family's air wars will take place in the war zone, a space constructed and reset every generation by Ancestor Hugo. The main fixture of this world is that for its residents and the general world, time moves 100 times faster than normal. Although this space is virtually constructed, the danger, injuries, and death are very much real. Chapter 1918. Published at 8th of June 2023 9:50 and 31 seconds AM. Chapter 1918. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1918. Door frame. Prev. Chapter. Lionel leaned on a door frame, his expression hard to read. On a bed with a young girl slept soundly. Well, he still saw her as a young girl, anyway. In reality, her age was probably almost double his by now. However, considering her naivete, he really couldn't look at her any other way. This young girl was none other than little Nana. It had been years since Lionel had seen her last, even if he disregarded the over 20 years he had missed out on. She had grown into a woman now, but her mind didn't seem to have changed very much. Lionel's emotional intelligence was quite high, but when it came to real psychological theories, his understanding was limited. This was why he had left the raising of Candle and Vice to Wise Star Order despite the inherent danger that came with it. Back then, Nana hadn't even been 10 years old if he remembered correctly, but she had gone through something that could only be said to be traumatic. It wasn't too surprising for her to carry lingering scars from back then, and the fact that she still seemed to be obsessed with him only went to further prove this. Yes, he had saved her life when all hope had seemed lost, but that didn't seem like enough for a woman who was almost 40 years old now to still be clinging to him, especially when he was certain that little Nana's life was filled with blood and carnage. It was just odd. Nana's pearly blue eyes suddenly snapped open and she shot up, her head snapping from left to right until she suddenly noticed Lionel standing at the door. Her gaze lit up for a moment, but when she noticed the sternness of Lionel's expression, they dimmed almost immediately. She looked down as though she had done something wrong and she found it difficult to look up again. Lionel sighed, moving toward the young woman and taking a seat at the edge of the bed. Nana, you understand that we stand on two opposing sides of a war, right? Lionel had thought a lot about how he would approach this conversation. The smart thing to do would be to toss Nana into a dungeon along with anyone else who had survived and call it a day. However, he couldn't bring himself to do so. Nana's small mouth opened a few times, but nothing came out. Not everything will go your way, sometimes everyone works inside the gray and there are no heroes or villains. The ultimate choice with what you do with your life depends on you. You have parents, you have a family, you have many who care for you. There will probably come a time where I won't be able to be so lenient. Do you understand me? Nana still couldn't seem to make a sound, so she nodded, her tears falling like a string of crystal beads. Lionel nodded lightly. I have no choice but to keep you here. If you can escape, that will be up to your skill, but it won't be aided by me. Lionel stood to his feet and walked toward the exit of the room, but even after he made it to the threshold, Nana still hadn't done anything. He sighed and shook his head. That could be considered to be Nana's last chance of escaping. Here, with just the two of them, overpowering him wouldn't be all that difficult for her, especially considering her ability index. But she was still too indecisive to act. Lionel left and closed the door behind him, sealing it with a powerful force art. His current morality was hard to pin down, maybe even for him. But he simply acted as he pleased. He felt gross taking advantage of a little girl's trauma to gain an advantage over her, so he had given her a chance. Since she didn't want to take it, his conscience was clear and his heart was light. With long strides, Lionel entered the dungeon of the flagship. As a war machine designed to be used by the highest echelons of the seventh dimension, it was unsurprising that their dungeons were incredibly robust. It would probably be difficult even for an expert of the eighth dimension to escape, though very much possible. As for those beneath that realm, there was likely no chance at all. Soon, Lionel stood across from a chained Adrin. He was in a much less comfortable position than his little sister, but Lionel did not feel the need to treat him very well just because of who he was related to. The two of them owed each other nothing. In fact, if there was anyone who owed the other anything, it was Adrin who owed him. Lionel pulled up a stool. Why don't you tell me what you know about the four great families? Lionel uttered with a smile. Adrin looked toward Lionel with a pair of piercing blue eyes. His wrists were chained above his head, and basically the only thing keeping him alive was the steady stream of force being pumped into him through them. Even if he wanted to starve to death, he couldn't. On the bright side, these dungeons were so rarely used that they're practically spotless. No answer. Lionel chuckled and didn't seem to mind. The souls of the 4 Brazingers that Aina was torturing were still there. He could go and retrieve them any time, and there would be no escaping for them. This meant that he would get information he wanted one way or another. Lionel had already gained a lot from Simeon, but the problem was that the latter's standing was too low. He wondered if Adrin would know more or not. I heard that you 4 families have quite the feud with my Fox family, and even my Northern Star lineage. It could be said that we're destined to be enemies, no? Adrin's pupils constricted. It's quite embarrassing, for families that are so powerful, still scared of 2 lineage factors that barely have any remnants remaining. Do not you think it's a bit embarrassing? Chapter 1919. Published at 8th of June 2023 9:50 and 31 seconds AM. Chapter 1919. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1919. What do you know? Previous chapter. Adrin's expression darkened. You have no idea what you're talking about. You have no idea how cruel those 2 lineage factors are, how much harm they've caused to the world. They don't deserve to exist. Adrin realized that his emotions were more easily agitated than they should have been, but he shrugged this feeling off quite quickly. His people had died, the status of his sister was unknown, he had been chained like a beast, and now he was being interrogated by someone with the most annoying smile he had seen in his life. He had the right to be pissed off. Lionel pursed his lips and nodded. The Northern Star lineage factors can get quite sinister, and controlling the dead after their death is definitely quite horrible. I can see how you could reach that conclusion. I don't really see how that's any worse than epigenetics and public torturing and executing innocents just because you think they fell in love with the wrong person, though. If you ask me, the tools of those lineage factors might seem cruel on the surface, but their evil is ultimately decided by the person controlling them. But for you all, what's your excuse, exactly? You just really like your blue hair? God forbid you end up with black hair, that would make you far too normal. Adrin grit his teeth, his eyes going red, but he didn't know how to respond. He knew that Lionel was referring to what happened to Aina's parents, but the Brazinger family wasn't the only one that had done such cruel things. In order to keep their bloodlines pure and within their control, all 4 families had done horrible things in the past. Nothing to say? Interesting, Lionel nodded again. What confuses me though, is that you know the Emperor's might lineage factor is in my hands, and yet you still want to resist. That's a bit silly, don't you think? Adrin shivered from head to toe. He had never seen that lineage factor in action, but he had read and heard enough about it. It had a huge taboo attached to it and struck fear in countless races. He didn't want to end up like one of those puppets, being forced to smile, nod and dance for the man who had killed him in the first place for all of eternity. Suddenly, Adrin snapped out of it, shaking his head from side to side vigorously. He grit his teeth and eventually sneered. Nice try. Just because you have the lineage factor, doesn't mean you understand its secrets. It took countless generations to create those techniques. I don't believe you have them. The tablets have. You mean this? A golden tablet appeared in Lionel's hand. Interesting, so you do know about these. Then do you know what's the difference between this and this one? Lionel brought out the silver tablet right afterward. Adrin's trembling grew to the point he began to hyperventilate. The fear buried in the depths of his heart was so great that he couldn't even look at the tablets anymore, closing his eyes as tightly as he could. It would be a fate worse than death to end up in Lionel's hands. He couldn't. Hey! Lionel's voice echoed with a mysterious power, snapping Adrin awake. If you understand the kind of situation you're in, then answer my questions obediently. I don't have the time to baby you. This. Adrin's chest heaved. Lionel had forcefully stopped his panic attack with a shout. He didn't even know how to process that. The silver tablet, what is it? Lionel asked coldly, his smile vanishing. He had suddenly gone from someone hoping for answers, to someone who was demanding them. The change caused the air to be caught in Adrin's throat and the pressure forced him to answer almost immediately. I don't know. You don't know? Lionel raised an eyebrow. I only know that it's an opportunity that happens here. Here? Lionel frowned. What's that supposed to mean? I don't know, I really don't know. My standing in the Aderna family is lower than you think. Even Simeon has a higher standing than I do. It's just that his needy talent placed him near my level. If not for my sister, I would not even be as powerful as I am now, at least not so quickly. What do you know about it? They're gateways. No, they're keys. I'm not sure, it's one or the other, or both. Gateways. Keys. They're shortcuts, right? Shortcuts. All I know is that they're created with a strong concentration of time force and dream force. Time force and dream force? Yes, it's the strongest force in all of existence, infinity force. The only force that can match it is anarchic force. Lionel fell into silence. How does infinity force relate to breaking force? Infinity force is all forces, and all forces are infinity force, just the same way anarchic force swallows all forces. So this silver tablet gives access to infinity force? It's silver, so it only gives a portion. There are gold shortcuts? I'm not sure, but even if it was gold it would not give perfect access to infinity force. Infinity force is too powerful to be used by any creature. What are the abilities of this silver tablet, then? It should be able to help you to progress faster. It breaks bottlenecks for you and can give you enlightenment in exchange for energy. However, the silver tablet only works up to the perfection of the 7th dimension. It can also act as a second life so long as you are beneath the 8th dimension. Lionel looked down at the silver tablet. It seemed that shortcut was, indeed, an appropriate name. He had known about this ability of the silver tablet, in fact he had made use of it before. It was thanks to it that he went from Tier 1 to Tier 9 of the 5th dimension of his metal body back then. Without it, he would not have been able to win that fight against those 6th-dimensional powerhouses that were targeting Earth. However, he hadn't used it since then because relying on it made future breakthroughs much more difficult. Luckily, absorbing those demon force pills had allowed him to perfect his foundation and deal with the lingering issues. He was hesitant to use it again for those reasons. What do you know about force manipulation? Chapter 1920. Published at 19th of June 2023 10:55 and 4 seconds AM. Chapter 1920. Tell me if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Adrin trembled when he heard this question, looking toward Lionel with a wide gaze. Force manipulation wasn't something widely spoken about. It was a secret even more closely held than the existences of the Emperor's might and Northern Star lineage factors. Of course, the reason for this was because those two lineage factors were considered taboos, and as such the legend of them was spread only for the sake of disparaging the families that had once used them. But even so, this was the reality. Most beneath a certain standard only stumbled onto force manipulation through anecdotes and countless years of training. However, the true and systematic methods were only held in the hands of a very select few, and maybe only the spirituals could boast having any sort of methods that was anywhere near complete. Lionel's gaze narrowed when he saw Adrin's reaction. In truth, he had guessed much of what Adrin was thinking of right now, and there was a very simple reason for that. In the Cataclysm Zone, he had seen all sorts of treasures that could be exchanged for, even to the point of laying eyes on the Emperor's might golden tablet, but not once had he seen anything even remotely refer to force manipulation. On the one hand, it was possible that the zone was just incomplete. It was a zone, after all, so it was possible that it wasn't a supremely perfect representation of reality. With something as hard to emulate as force manipulation, it made sense if it wasn't all that easy for it to be replicated. If zones relied on dream force to build everything, it would eventually have a limit. It had to be remembered that dream force was a force itself, obviously. It was one thing to emulate other forces at lower resolutions or weaker states, but if it was tasked with emulating other forces at their very best, which is exactly what force manipulation represented, it would no doubt reach a bottleneck it couldn't pass through, a bottleneck that would only become more stringent the more powerful the force was. This explanation had been good enough for Lionel to accept back then, good enough that it didn't bother him too much. However, there had always been a second explanation lingering in the back of his mind. And that was that force manipulation was a secret. While it was impossible to stop geniuses from stumbling onto methods to better control their force, so long as there was a tacit suppression of information about such methods, generally speaking, disallowing the sharing of such methods, it would be fairly easy to suppress. Lionel had always had a theory brewing in mind, one that he only confirmed further as he gained more split minds. The difference between humans and apes of third-dimensional Earth were only partial percentages of DNA. If you dropped an ape in the middle of a forest, and did the same with a human, their difference in intelligence wouldn't be meaningful enough that their quality of life would be drastically different. What truly separated humans was the ability to communicate. Thanks to this evolution, humans were able to stack their small advantage in intelligence through the generations. With each small advancement an individual made, large numbers of the race benefited, until eventually humans pulled so far ahead of animals that they painted the illusion that they were infinitely more intelligent. When you take that advantage, and you suffocate it, what would happen? The result would be what was seen with force manipulation. You would have sporadic geniuses here and there, but with no ability to communicate and share insights. All advancement would stall with the end of said genius life, and then the next genius would have to start all over. It was akin to Isaac Newton never sharing his invention of calculus and everyone having to deduce it on their own. Imagine a world where instead of calculus having been an annoying middle to high school level subject, it was instead a thesis one aspired to. The difference was akin to night and day. The question, then, was why? But that answer was even more obvious. Force manipulation was force multiplier, not in the sense of energy, but rather a general sense. The only way for those born with weaker talent to catch up to those with stronger talent was through force manipulation. With the selfishness of the four great families, how could they possibly allow those beneath them to have a chance to rise up? The cobra demon that Lionel had faced was the perfect example. He had been an exceptionally weak demon to start, and the forces he used weren't particularly impressive either, but he was so powerful that Lionel, even given all his talent, couldn't last even a single exchange against him and had to be eaten alive just to stand a chance. This was what force manipulation did. One's raw talent was almost entirely decided by their bloodline and lineage. It was something that could be easily controlled and assessed. While ability indexes were a potential variable, it was likewise difficult to maximize them without force manipulation and could have their effects dampened as a result. The obsession the four great families had over maintaining their lineage and purity was clear and obvious, and now there seemed to be a more tangible reason why. The trouble was that force manipulation relied on inspiration and intelligence, two things that were far more difficult to control for. Even for families at this level, accounting for the complexity of the human brain was almost impossible. Suddenly, Lionel's gaze flickered as a spark flew in his dreamscape. He suddenly remembered how cheap the Dream Force items were in the treasure exchange. Could that be a coincidence? If there was one variable that perfectly correlated with intelligence, it was Dream Force affinity. Could there be a power that was attempting to undermine the four great families through the use of Dream Force? Lionel's finger tapped at his knee as he fell into deep thought. Things were rarely ever so simple. It would be foolish to draw such a conclusion now. With that thought, he looked up. You clearly know something, so let's not waste time, okay? Tell me what you know. Chapter 1921. Published at 19th of June 2023, 10:55 and 3 seconds AM. Chapter 1921, even. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The beads of sweat poured down Adrin's brow. If others learned that he told outsiders about this, his death would be practically guaranteed. He wasn't even worthy of having this information, but his little sister had reached a level of status where it was tacitly allowed for her to bring this information back to her bloodline. Due to this, he had benefited. The reality was that the true name of this principle wasn't even force manipulation, it was just that the moment Lionel had said those words, he understood exactly what he was referring to. This was inevitable. Lionel had deduced the existence of force manipulation himself, so he had also, of course, named it himself. He originally hadn't expected Adrien to know what he was talking about at all, but it seemed that he was right to ask. Lionel leaned back in his chair, patient. Adrien wasn't going anywhere and there was only one path forward for him. There was nothing that the latter could say to get out of this. Adrien took a deep breath. They call it dimensional layering or dimensional folding. According to what I know, the true reason we call our progress dimensions is because of the existence of dimensional layering and the principles behind it. It's said that worlds fundamentally change after crossing into the fourth heaven and gain force, which fundamentally changes the laws of physics, but the reality is that even in its infancy and before a metamorphosis, force exists. The trouble is that it exists in folds of reality that aren't perceptible. With the way they layer, they can't interact with the real world, and worlds at and below the third dimension are water to their oil. Lionel frowned. There are worlds beneath the third dimension? Yes. The first dimension is known as the impetus of creation. Some believe it's God, some believe that it's the Big Bang, some others have any number of other theories and explanations for what it might be. Ultimately, it's just the moment right before existence comes to be. The second dimension is known as the impetus of life. It's said that this is a reality that only the regulator can exist within. The impetus of life is both an instant of time and an infinite strength of time. It both touches a moment in time and all moments in time. It's a single line that wraps around all things that are, have been, or ever will be. Lionel's gaze narrowed. From the very beginning, the impetus of creation, force exists. When the third dimension forms, it can begin to slowly unfurl itself. When the fourth dimension descends, it matures and fully unfurls itself. Lionel's frown deepened. Fully? Adrien nodded somewhat nervously. Depending on the strength of a force, it will climb onto dimensional layers as though it was scaffolding. The stronger the force, the more scaffolding it needs and the more layers it will stretch into. The process of dimensional folding is taking the complex folds of a force, untangling it, and layering such that it could be used with less and less scaffolding. This is the best way to strengthen your force and the only method of making a weaker force stronger than a more powerful force. The other way of doing it is making your body stronger scaffolding, Lionel muttered, seemingly not needing Adrien's confirmation. Adrien trembled once again before he sighed. This was the difference between someone with talent and someone without it. He had had all of this explained to him, but Lionel didn't even need him to finish. Indeed, there were two ways of strengthening your force. The first was through dimensional folding, or decreasing the amount of scaffolding your force needed to function. The second was through normal practicing. By strengthening your body, you gave your force more scaffolding to work with, and thus made it functionally stronger. However, this method required you to have great talent, otherwise, you would eventually run into a bottleneck where progress became impossible. This was why it was called dimensions. You were using your body as a proxy for something your force manipulation should be doing, and as such, you were missing out on a lot of strength. And of course, the best results would occur when you did both at once, and best of all when you used the two in a feedback loop of sorts. Lionel had a feeling that leaning into force manipulation would open a path to breaking through bottlenecks you would otherwise lack the talent to make it through. Lionel felt his entire perspective changing. He wasn't strengthening his forces, he was just bringing them back to their origin. The more of them he understood, the easier he could fold them, and the more of them he folded, the more of its power he could use with less scaffolding, and thus the more powerful his output would be. The more powerful the force he was working with, the more effort he needed to put into folding it. Scarlet Star Force was a ninth-dimensional force, so it needed all 9-dimensional layers to unfurl itself. If Lionel wanted to shrink what it needed, he would have to truly extend himself. Snow Force was just a 6-dimensional force, so it only needed 6-dimensional layers to unfurl itself. As such, it took less effort to fold it. This was a simplified version, but Lionel felt that he was missing something. That was because despite the fact he was already in the 6th dimension, he still felt that there was quite a bit more powerful to extricate from Snow Force. That was when Lionel's gaze suddenly blazed to life. He understood. The first dimension was the impetus of creation. The second dimension was the impetus of life. What had Adrin said about the latter? He had said that it was both one instant and all instants, a line that touched all things. How could a single human body match this level of grandeur? Thinking of the dimensional levels as perfectly analogous to real dimensions was the wrong way of thinking. They were at most approximations. The more talented you were, the better your approximation, but Lionel didn't believe any normal living being could ever match existence. That was simply impossible. Ultimately, the body would forever be limited by the third dimension. Alone, it could not access the more fundamental dimensions. Even the regulator could not return to the first dimension. While you could rely on your body and affinities as an approximation, the only way to truly match the grandeur of the dimensional verse was to fold your force, was to reach a point where your force manipulation reached this untouchable level, a level only the regulator could exist within, and maybe, ultimately, a level even the regulator could not reach. Chapter 1922. Published at 19th of June 2023 10:54 and 54 seconds AM. Chapter 1922 states if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1922 states Adrin fell into silence. The glow in Lionel's gaze was almost blinding. He could practically see the thoughts flying behind it. Currently, Lionel was doing something most couldn't fathom. He was restricting his entire thought process and flipping his former ideologies on their heads. While it was possible that Adrin's explanations were limited and incomplete, Lionel felt that they were very close to the reality, so much so that he acted on them almost immediately. With the shift in ideology, Lionel could almost feel his body becoming lighter and stronger. Even without new comprehensions, he felt that the road forward was clearer and his comprehension of the runes he had grasped shifted and changed, becoming stronger. The ninth dimensional complete runes that were within his innate node now only represented superficial scaffolding. If he really wanted to make perfect use of them, he had to comprehend them and then shrink them until only one simple rune remained, the very rune that would have been the impetus of creation for this force. The glow in Lionel's eyes slowly faded, but the sharpness within them didn't vanish entirely. His gaze shifted, landing on Adrin. Tell me what else you know. I only know the general path, but it's all very vague and I don't have in-depth information about any of it. That's fine, just explain. The first dimensional fold level is the unfurled state. Usually, it's only attainable by either reaching the equivalent dimension of your force's grade, having an equivalent dimensional grade affinity, forming a star with it, or by having an innate node, though the latter three often come hand in hand. Only when you have full access to your force can the next step begin. Lionel listened intently, his gaze focused. It seemed that even if you wanted to take the route of force manipulation to make up for your lack of talent, you still had to reach a certain level first. But then again, there was nothing stopping you from choosing to focus on a fourth dimensional force in the beginning, and then switching to a related force in the future. That way, you would always be able to keep up with those in your generation. Lionel didn't know it, but he had just casually thought of something quite profound. The foundation of this thought would result in many changes in the future. To step beyond the unfurled state is something that most will never accomplish in their lifetimes. It takes a certain level of genius to take even half a step out of it, let alone stepping out entirely. Lionel chuckled. Is that what they told you? Adrin froze when he heard this, looking into Lionel's eyes. If it was really so difficult, why would they put so much effort into hiding it? I bet if you told 10 people these methods, 7 or 8 of them would be able to make it out. Whether they'd be able to make it further, though. Suddenly, Adrin felt a light of hope. Indeed, that was something they had told him. But if it was so difficult, this sort of secrecy wouldn't be necessary. It seemed that despite tacitly allowing his knowledge of this matter, they still took the steps to dampen his spirits, and he had fallen for it so easily. Adrin seemed to relax, the resistance he had had against Lionel seemingly vanishing into thin air. Beyond the unfurled state is what's known as the layered state. Depending on the level of the force, it will have more or less of these layered states, and also depending on its strength, moving through these layers will give you varied results. The number of layers is dependent on the difference between your force's dimensional grade and the sixth dimension. Forces at and lower than the sixth dimension all have just a single layer. For every step above the sixth dimension, there is an additional layer for a maximum of 4-dimensional layers at the 9th dimension. Lionel raised an eyebrow. Why the 6th dimension? These are details I do not know. But there should be something special about the 6th and 9th dimensions respectively. It's likely related to the fact life starts at the 3rd dimension. The 4th dimensional layer unique to 9th dimensional forces is also unique as well, and these things are probably related. It's probably more accurate to say that there are 3 potential layers and a 4th bonus layer known as the transcendent layer. But my sister only vaguely told me about these things as she doesn't understand the details either. Either way, the 6th dimension is the first hallmark and the 3rd dimension is the second. The first state is the unfurled state, the second is the layered state, and the third is the impetus state. You are probably right about them fooling me with the truth of the unfurled state, but according to my little sister, she has only ever heard of 8th dimensional existences even getting close to the impetus state. And reaching the impetus state is the requirement to enter the 9th dimension. Lionel nodded slowly. Returning your force to the 3rd dimension was technically the theoretical limit of humans and all races in general. The foundation of the body was rooted in the 3rd dimension and building began from there, so the impetus state could be considered the perfect stage. With the layered state, it depends. But usually, only absolute geniuses 7th dimensional experts would reach perfection. Of course, reaching perfection varies depending on the force in question. Normally, just being in the layered state at all and taking a step or two makes you elite within the 7th dimension. If you reach the half-step layered state, or, in other words, take a half-step out of the unfurled state, you should be considered among the 1% of the 1% of the 6th dimension. This is about the general difficulty. As for beyond that, it's basically unheard of. They call them the life state and finally the creation state, as you've probably guessed. They're related to the 2nd dimension and 1st dimension respectively. There is probably no one who has entered the creation state. As for the life state, there is probably only a handful of existences even within the 4 great families. In fact, if I had to guess, there is probably only one per family. As for the creation state, the only existences who stand a chance are probably in the spiritual race. No other race stands a chance. Lionel's gaze practically shone. Chapter 1923. Published at 19th of June 2023 10:53 and 54 seconds AM. Chapter 1923. 1923 states if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1923 states Lionel exhaled as he finished restructuring his approach. His dream world shifted and became more complex, his simulations becoming more perfect as his comprehension of the dimensions deepened. At that moment, a surge of star force rotated around Lionel. Although it seemed like he was still talking to Adrin, with every moment, he seemed to improve by leaps and bounds. Although this didn't cause huge fundamental changes to his overall strength, the bottlenecks that lay ahead of him seemed to unlock one after another, loosening as though a zipper being separated. A sense of enlightenment hovered above Lionel's head and his comprehension of the 6th dimensional layer of dimensional cleanse accelerated until suddenly he grasped it all. He had yet to even practice the 6th dimensional layer, and yet it was suddenly all so clear to him. At the same time, he caught a faint look at the 7th dimensional layer, deducing its earlier portions vaguely despite having never laid eyes on it before. Lionel's hair fluttered. Despite sitting in place and never moving, Adrin suddenly found it difficult to focus on his figure. Lionel seemed both there and not there at all, as though he had entirely fused into the world. The cognitive dissonance between what his eyes were seeing and what his senses could track made him dizzy. He was forced to blink several times, but even then he couldn't seem to get rid of that feeling. Lionel didn't notice Adrin's oddity at all, or rather he was simply not paying attention to it as he continued to deduce. Vital star force. Should be in the unfurled state. Lionel felt that he was close to taking a half step out of the unfurled state with his vital star force, but he wasn't quite there yet. This somewhat surprised him. He thought he had made great progress with it, especially after scanning the mantra and rebuilding his divine armor. But it seemed that he had made an incorrect assumption. He still had a small way to go. If he had to pin it down, if the unfurled state was separated into lower, middle, perfect and finally half step, he was currently at perfect. His fire force, in general, was at a half-step layered state, a step above his vital star force. However, his scarlet star force was, once again, at the perfect unfurled state. This had little to do with his own advancement and was entirely related to his innate nodes. With them, he had practically always been at this level. Of course, that was if he circulated his scarlet star force through his innate nodes first. This went to show just how difficult it was to dimensional fold ninth-dimensional forces. But now that his approach had changed, Lionel felt that the path forward was much clearer. What surprised him even further was that his void star force was also in a perfect unfurled state. He had formed 2 stars with them, so this made sense according to the information that Adrin had given him. But something felt off. The scarlet star force I use from my innate nodes is far more powerful than the void star force I use from my stars. So how are they at the same level? Lionel's gaze narrowed as he looked toward his emulation spatial force innate node, and he noticed the same thing. First layered state. I see. Lionel suddenly understood. The abilities of an innate node were more than he had known previously, but this made sense. Not only did innate nodes give him high affinity, but they also gave a boost to force manipulation. Without his innate node, his emulation spatial force was at half-step layered state, but with it, it crossed the barrier. As for his scarlet star force, it was at the perfect unfurled state, and it inched toward half-step layered state thanks to his innate nodes. And if Lionel circulated the force from his much larger innate node and he felt like he was almost burned up. As expected. Not just first layered state, but second layered state. It's actually so much more powerful. If only it didn't also want to kill me. The gap between unfurled and layered was so large that his smaller innate node couldn't help his scarlet star force cross even a half step. However, his larger innate node was such an anomaly that it crossed not just a half step, but 2 complete steps. As for his emulation spatial force, the reason it was at the first layered state was because Lionel could naturally enter the half-step layered state on his own, and the reason for that was because my dream force. First layered state, already approaching the second layered state of 4. Dream force was a 9th-dimensional force, and Lionel's comprehension of it had greatly deepened in recent days. If it wasn't for the fact that dream force was only a small portion of emulation spatial force, with the help of his innate node, he wouldn't just be at the first layered state, he might already be able to use it at the second layered state, and unlike his scarlet star force, it wouldn't be trying to kill him. It seemed that the runes on his innate nodes weren't useless. They served a real purpose, but in the end he would still have to ultimately rely on himself. Even so, innate nodes were a huge advantage. Now that Lionel understood dimensional folding and how the process worked and wasn't moving around blindly, he could use his innate nodes like a guiding light in the dark. Every step forward he took, his innate nodes would show him where to place his foot down next. If he approached things like this, his improvement would be impossibly fast. In fact, he could already feel it. Lionel's gaze flickered and the heat around him suddenly skyrocketed. Adrin inched back in his cell, trying to distance himself, but he still felt as though layers of his skin were being peeled off. Suddenly, the heat vanished entirely and runes began to dance in Lionel's irises. He could now use his scarlet star force at a half-step layered state level relying on his smaller innate node. Chapter 1924. Published at 19th of June 2023 10:53 and 45 seconds AM. Chapter 1924. 1924 A way. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1924 A way. Lionel's gaze sharpened as he reeled in his force, controlling it until the heat vanished entirely. According to Adrin, entering the half-step layered state placed him within the top percentile of 6-dimensional existences. However, Lionel didn't know whether this was a measure of the 4 great families alone, or if it was the entirety of the dimensional verse. If it was the 4 great families alone, then it might be slightly more impressive. But if it was the dimensional verse as a whole, this likely meant that there were a few geniuses out there who could defeat him within the 6th dimension. Lionel felt that it was more appropriate to lean toward the latter. As he had deduced earlier, stepping into the layered state wasn't impossible so long as you had the patience and the knowledge. This was why the four great families wanted to hide its truth to begin with. This more than likely meant that while it was rare, it wasn't exceptionally so to be at Lionel's level. The only advantage Lionel had was his larger Scarlet Star innate node, which allowed him to touch the second layered state of 4, but using it was like a double-edged blade. At the same time, Lionel understood that in order to reach the level Y Star Order had spoken about within 100 years and save himself from being devoured by his own innate node, he would need to reach the impetus stage. Only that way could he fully control his innate node. Beyond that would be the cherry on the sundae. Then, how does weapon force fit into all of this? Lionel's gaze narrowed as he focused on his spear force and weapon force, trying to catch a glimpse at something. A mysterious feeling gripping his heart. Suddenly, Lionel's pupils constricted. Second layered state. There was something very special here, though. Observing it with his new perspective, Lionel felt something special. He could suddenly feel the effect his sovereignty had for the very first time. If before it had been an intangible existence, it now felt like a real force he could move and control. This wasn't due to him becoming a true sovereign. If it was, Lionel would have sensed it before. This change had specifically come with his change in perspective. Much like his innate node, his sovereignty seemed capable of increasing his control and extending his dimensional folding ability. This was the most clear with weapon forces because from what Lionel could tell, it was reliant on his current dimensional level. Because he was in the 6th dimension, and his spear force was likewise in the 6th dimension, under his perfect control, he was granted a first layered state. Due to his sovereignty, he was given an entire level more, and thus gained the second layered state. If Lionel entered the 7th dimension right this moment and his spear force remained in the 6th dimension, it would enter the 3rd layered state. If he was in the 6th dimension and his spear force improved to the 7th dimension, he would fall to the 1st layered state. If he moved into the 7th dimension with his spear force, then it would remain at the 2nd layered state. This was Lionel's general comprehension after some experimentation. He was essentially being forced to balance the quality of his weapon force with his level of control over it. The more he suppressed his weapon force, the greater extent of control his sovereignty would have over it, and thus the higher state he would be able to force his force manipulation into. However, the obvious trade-off was that his weapon force would remain the equivalent of weaker forces. This realization gave a whole new meaning to Nelligan's words previously. What if a suppressor was an individual who understood this fact intimately and chose to purposely suppress their weapon forces so that they could gain greater and greater control over them? If Lionel had maintained his spear force at the 5th dimension, then right now it would be in the 3rd layered state. When he stepped into the 7th dimension, it would enter the 4th layered state, and then finally, when he entered the 8th dimension, he would be able to enter the impetus state and thus reach the requirements necessary for entering the 9th dimension in a single step. Lionel hadn't known this before, but even though he was now aware of it, he didn't regret his decision to form 6th-dimensional spear and bow force. There had to be another way. Lionel didn't believe that this was the only way. He didn't believe that something as fundamental as weapon forces would be limited to such an extent. There was definitely a method of both raising your spear force to the 9th dimension and dimensional folding it down to the impetus state and even beyond. Lionel didn't have any tangible evidence for this, but he believed that such a path had to exist. Lionel suddenly remembered how when he first learned spear force, he had wanted to find his own path, even to the point where he had refused to learn even the names of the higher states of force. Of course, now that he had read through the entire Void Library, this information was impossible for him to have skipped over, but thinking back to that mentality he had had, Lionel quite liked it. Suddenly, Lionel pierced out with 2 fingers. The sound of splitting wind echoed, but before it faded, he had already pierced out again. Swift. Lionel's brows trembled. Forceful. His heart skipped a beat. A land of blood rivers appeared to Lionel's back, his change in aura causing adrenaline to bite his lips so hard that he drew blood himself, but this blood, under some sort of odd magnetic force, rushed toward Lionel's pointed finger, turning his spear force scarlet red. But this only lasted for a moment before the world fell into complete silence, a melody played by the beating of Adrin's heart being all that remained. Lionel went through all 3 stages of his grandfather's spear mastery until the final, ultimate step. In that final moment, pushing everything to the limit, his spear force crossed that barrier, transcending the second layered state and entering the third. As expected, there really was a way. Chapter 1925. Published at 19th of June 2023, 10:53 and 44 seconds AM. Chapter 1925. 1925 choice. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1925 choice. A combination of Lionel's personal skill, his personal affinity and likely his lineage factor gave him access to the first layered state. His sovereignty gave him a step above that, allowing him to enter the second layered state. And, finally, perfecting his grandfather's way of the spear gave him an entire level above that, allowing him to enter the third layered state. If Lionel suppressed his spear and bow force from now on, this would mean that he would be able to replicate the feat of those who suppressed their weapon forces at the 5th dimension, but this time with a 6th-dimensional force. This would mean that he would be able to suppress a suppressor with his spear force alone should they be at the same level. In fact, suppression might be too benign a word to describe the level of advantage Lionel would have. However, Lionel wasn't satisfied with just this alone. If his grandfather's way of the spear was worth an entire state, then if he improved upon it further, there should definitely be more to gain. Lionel had already made progress on the next step, and if he could elevate it to the 4th layered state, there would be another qualitative change. But then what about destruction's sovereignty? Lionel tried to access it like he had with his spear and bow force, but for some reason, no matter how much he tried, it was all useless. He couldn't seem to sense it at all, even with the changed state of his mind. He simply didn't have an explanation for it. Lionel sat in silence for a while before he threw it to the back of his mind, beginning to test his weapon forces in other ways. He began to fuse his other forces into it, testing its limits and trying out what differences there might be. He realized quickly that fusing his spear force with forces he had less control over lowered his ability to dimensional fold. Even when he circulated his grandfather's methods, it was impossible to maintain the 3rd layered state. However, it wasn't all bad. Using a higher dimensional force like his Scarlet Star force elevated his spear force that it mitigated the loss in control. The ultimate result was comparable and sometimes even faintly stronger than just relying on a 3rd layered state. This made Lionel even more determined to refine his own way of the spear. A higher force manipulation didn't always make you invincible, though it did go a long way. If you faced someone in a higher dimension, using higher dimensional forces, you could still lose. Force manipulation was a force multiplier, but it had its limits, limits one had to push to the greatest extent to give themselves the best chance to claim victory. Lionel suddenly stood to his feet, exhaling a breath. He still had many questions, but his heart felt light. After some thought, he waved a hand and the chains binding Adrin's wrists unlocked, though the ones on his ankles remained. Once he was done, he walked away. He had no intention of releasing Adrin anytime soon, but he would allow him to be more comfortable. The information the latter had given him was more valuable than maybe even Adrin himself knew, and it would become the foundation for the nightmare of the 4 great families. Lionel's gaze glowed brighter with every step he took. These air wars would be fun, he wouldn't let anyone stand in the way of him taking over the Morales family. And very soon, no one would be able to stop him from unifying the whole of the human domain and the dimensional verse beyond. A dense purple glow flourished around him. Adworth finished his explanation, looking forward with a light smile on his face. His expression seemed light and carefree without the slightest hint of worry. He had explained this quite simply, but the true danger of that realm wouldn't be felt until everyone stepped within. If there's nothing else, then this meeting can be adjourned, Adworth said with a smile. The air wars will begin a year from now. Adworth's smile didn't waver after he said this, but the eyes of many narrowed. This time was clearly an attempt to buy time, but with the arrogant momentum of the Morales, no one dared to say anything for now. Except the one person who had nearly ruined everything to begin with. A moment. The word seemed to be a request, but the inflection carried an undeniable weight. At the same time, the voice was soft, soothing and bone-melting, and yet carried a sternness that was impossible to refute. The only person present who could balance such things was the scorned Queen Beauty, Cynthia Oman. Seemingly without a need to wait to make sure others were listening, and her eyes half closed, Cynthia began to speak lightly. A year is excessive. The air wars will decide the direction of the human domain as it faces threats from all sides. Too much can happen in this time. A month is already too long, but I feel that it's the most appropriate given the circumstances. Second, you are free to feel indignant for your treatment, but your indignance is irrelevant to me. The facts as they are laid out seem to bear out that the Morales want a monopoly on Earth. Whether you claim this isn't your intention doesn't matter, this will be functionally the case. I can only speak for myself, but I will be sending participants with the sole purpose of ensuring that one Lionel Morales does not gain control of the Morales family, and should I sense the Morales family pulling strings to ensure his victory, I will act with the appropriate swiftness. I see these air wars as the only method of maintaining the decorum of the human domain and not crippling a family that has existed since our beginning. I hope you can see those efforts and respond in kind. If the Morales family is truly sincere, you would remove the child's right to participate in the first place. If you do that, the Oman family and the Guild Alliance will withdraw from this affair. If you insist on your ways, however, then we can only press forward with this farce and the Morales will lose a young genius. The choice is yours. After she said these words, Cynthia floated into the skies. She didn't seem to move very fast, and yet after a single blink, she had already appeared on her own flagship, disappearing a few moments later. When an eighth-dimensional existence spoke, the agreement of others wasn't needed. Her meaning was very clear. Accept her demands or the Oman family and their alliance would declare war. A cloud of dancing lightning began to slowly manifest above Alejandro's head, his temper threatening to flare out of control. Chapter 1926. Published at 19th of June 2023 10:53 and 41 seconds AM. Chapter 1926. Escalation. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The rumbling thunder above Alejandro's head suddenly expanded as he slowly stood to his feet. Arcs of lightning rushed through his pupils, the pillar beneath his suddenly cracking and nearly fracturing. Good, good, good. Alejandro raised his hands and the skies darkened instantly. Cynthia, who had just stepped on her flagship, paused, though she didn't turn back. Her dress fluttered in the wind, oddly peaceful compared to the raging storm rising around her. If you want the Morales family to lower their heads, you're all more foolish than I thought. Alejandro's voice crackled and boomed, the weather itself echoing his words across the horizon. It felt like in that moment, everyone in the solar system could hear his voice. Then wait for war, Cynthia said lightly, prepared to continue moving. Wait? Alejandro raised his head to the skies, his laughter causing the rumbling black clouds to thicken. Since you all dare to come here in an attempt to humiliate my Morales family, why should you ever think of leaving? Warriors of the Morales family. Alejandro's voice boomed so loud that even the elders representing exceptional families winced, their ears bleeding beneath the sound and pressure. Their hearts trembled as they realized that the Morales family wasn't all talk. Roars echoed from the planet below. Alejandro closed his palm, a mighty spear spiraling with rainbow lightning appearing in his hand. At the same time, the sound of clinking armor echoed and a surge of rainbow lightning seemed to form around his body, forming a radiant armor that sparkled both like rainbow crystals and streaking lightning. One after another, thousands began to rise into the skies, the clinking of armor filling the skies as divine armors of all kinds manifested. Some rumbled like volcanoes, others howled like wind, some were as tall as giants, and others stepped through the air as though it was solid ground, radiating dense earth force that steadily increased the gravity of the surroundings. Ha! The mixture of those that could rise into the skies and those that couldn't roared out. The white clouds that had clung to the bottom of the pillars dispersed, revealing a land below filled with men and women rushing to heed Alejandro's call. It was clear at a glance that the Morales family hadn't planned this in advance. Their gathering army lacked any sort of organization or forethought, but it was precisely this that made the hearts of so many tremble so fiercely. They didn't ask why, they didn't seek understanding, they didn't even seem to care if there was a reason at all. The moment they heard their patriarch's call, they came out in droves, bloodthirsty lights in their eyes. What was even more shocking was the fact that even though they should have known that so many powerhouses were coming today, they hadn't been on their guard at all. It was as though they had never regarded the rest of the human domain as something to take seriously in the first place. Their faith in their Morales family was completely infallible. It was disregard, complete and utter disregard. Compared to any words that Alejandro could speak, this spoke far louder than anything else could have. This was the spirit of the Morales family, and the actions they all had taken in the previous generation to suppress Velasco didn't seem to have had any effect on the culture of the Morales family at all. Since you all want war, you can have your war right now. Cynthia's gaze narrowed as she turned back, a hint of surprise in her eyes. She was intimately familiar with the Morales family, but it was easy to be madmen when you had the definite upper hand. The fact that they still dared to act like this despite the circumstances made her want to reevaluate them once again. However, she didn't get the chance to think about this even more, because a moment later, the Morales family surprised her once again. Boom! An old man with a fluttering off-white robe appeared high in the skies. His white beard fluttered while his head had not a single strand on it, shimmering almost as bright as the lightning that was still flickering about in the dark clouds. He cast an indifferent glance over the region before his gaze landed on Cynthia, causing her expression to become serious for the first time. The instant he appeared, two more old men seemed to tear through the void to appear, one appearing behind Amory, and the other appearing behind Nazag. Even so, the Morales elder in the skies didn't even glance in their direction. It's you who wants my Morales family to remove one of our heirs from contention? Cynthia turned and looked up. Her brows smoothed out and her gaze, as placid as a lake, met that of the Morales elder. I've made my stance clear already, is there a need to repeat? I speak for the Oman family. If the Morales want war, they can have dash. Since when was it the Oman family's place to speak on the affairs of my Morales family? The Morales elder raised his palm and suddenly grabbed out. Cynthia's pupils constricted. Before the palm even descended, her flagship began to creak and quake. Frowning, Cynthia gathered up her force to counter, but shockingly enough, she found it dispersing before she could fully gather it up. Cynthia realized at that moment that she couldn't fight back at all. Just when it seemed that she would be captured, a surging aura came from a pendant around her neck. Aren't you too shameless attacking a junior like this, Alvaro? A junior? So is that the excuse now? A moment ago, she was the speaker of the Oman family, but now she's an insignificant character? Someone will have to pay for this, and if you stand in the way, it will be you, Radrian. Bang! The slowly forming image of Radrian Oman shattered under Ancestor Alvaro's pressure. However, in its place, a swirling portal appeared. Radrian stepped across the void, raising a wrinkled hand to struggle against Alvaro's might. At that moment, everyone seemed to understand that the situation had escalated to a point of no return. Two ancestors had not only appeared, but were now exchanging blows. Chapter 1927. Published at 19th of June 2023 10:53 and 40 seconds AM. Chapter 1927. Never again. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Boom. Ancestor Radrian stepped out completely, his bent arm extending fully, and a rush of force beat back Ancestor Alvaro's force and eventually dispersed it. Ancestor Radrian's expression darkened. Is this really what you want to do, Alvaro? Ancestor Alvaro stood in the skies, the intent in his gaze blazing. With a wave of his hand, he pulled out a bronze spear with a menacing blade. Almost instantly, the howl of spear force sundered the skies, a violent swirl of sharp force stinging the eyes of all those who are foolish enough to look directly at it. The Morales family will not take a step back. Alvaro slammed the butt of his spear downward, causing cracks to appear in the air as though reality itself was shattering akin to fragile glass. With a flick of his wrist, he brandished his spear, crossing the distance between himself and Radrian. Radrian had no choice but to respond in kind, a dozen circular blades appearing around him. 3 took form along each one of his forearms, the rest shooting forward and surrounding Alvaro. A hint of solemnness pressed down between Radrian's brows. No one had expected the Morales to truly take things this far. They had all underestimated the kind of fury they had all held in their hearts the last time something like this had happened. The previous generation of Morales was too powerful, and their head was even more so. It was widely accepted that if nothing was done to dull their momentum and blades, the result would be the unification of the human domain under the Morales family. In truth, the Oman family had had little to do with what happened back then. With Cynthia being the assumed soon-to-be wife of Velasco, the prosperity of the Morales would be their prosperity. At least, that was what it seemed to be on the surface. Radrian was quite aware that there were many in the Oman family that felt that a genius like Cynthia should remain within their family. Allowing her to marry into the Morales would be as good as giving away a future pillar of their family. Back then, something similar had happened. Many refused to allow Velasco to become the patriarch of the Morales family. Velasco had never cared or wanted the position to begin with, so he had never intended on it to begin with. However, right on the heels of that, Ishmael, Leonel's grandfather, was killed. The fury of the Morales family after this happened was palpable, but after Velasco slaughtered his way into the Void Palace, the entire human domain was forced into a tumultuous state, and in order to calm things down, the Morales had to settle for the payback Velasco had gotten himself. The choice made back then was one no single elder of the Morales was happy with. In fact, some harbored hatred for Velasco, believing that his rash actions back then had disallowed them the opportunity to retaliate properly. This was because no small number of innocents had died under Velasco's rage back then. If the Morales still pressed forward, reason would have no longer entirely been on their side because many others had suffered. In the end, the Morales were forced to swallow their pride once, their bellies suffocating a large fire of fury, one that had been suppressed for many decades. Even so, they had all made one decision back then. Never again. The human domain had stepped on the lion's tail, but now they were surprised by the reaction. Radrian realized this as he exchanged blows with Alvaro, but it was already much too late. They had miscalculated, and it hadn't been by just a small amount. Shouldn't you be training right now? Leonel laid atop of Aina, looking into her eyes with a hardly hidden smile. If you want to tap out, just say so. Aina looked appalled. Tap out? If one of us is going to quit first, it'd be you. Leonel laughed. He had done anything in the past several weeks except mess around and roll around in bed with Aina. Very soon, we won't have time to rest, so we might as well take it now, don't you think? Leonel grinned. Of course, a quitter like you probably sees this as work. I can let the fair maiden off if she really can't handle it any longer. Aina's legs suddenly shifted and she pushed off her arms, spinning the two of them until she was the one riding on top. Leonel could feel her walls tightening around him. He seemed to realize that if it wasn't for his metal body, she probably could crush him, and this little vixen seemed to want to remind him of this. Aina smiled a wide smile. You don't seem to be taking the air wars as seriously as you should. Isn't this your dream, but look at you now. Leonel didn't seem to be listening as his gaze followed Aina's swinging breasts. They might as well have been a hypnotist's pendant with the way they had his attention. My dream? I'm dreaming of something entirely different right about now. Leonel mumbled. Aina giggled, leaning forward and smothering Leonel's face. Yup, definitely a dream. Leonel nodded to himself seriously, wrapping two arms around Aina's waist tightly. Look at you, you're like a child, I'm getting in the mind state necessary for baby number one. You're supposed to be a parent in that case, not a child. Says who? You be the adult, I'll be the best friend. Good cop, bad cop, it's a tale as old as the universe itself. Aina pinched Leonel's waist. You want to make our child hate me? How could they hate you? Leonel reached up and jiggled Aina's breasts. With food like this every day, they'll be grinning from ear to ear. Aina laughed and dropped the subject. It seemed that Leonel had no intention of being serious right this moment, so she decided to help his mind relax. Very soon, there really wouldn't be such an opportunity. Lowering her lips, she kissed him before he could let another joke fly. How was she supposed to enjoy herself if she was busy laughing? Chapter 1928. Published at 19th of June 2023, 10:53 and 38 seconds AM. Chapter 1928. Is that all? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Planet Morales fell into chaos. As Lionel was streaking across the stars, quickly approaching, he had no idea that a war had already broken out on his behalf. Lionel had already deduced that the Morales attempt to give him more time would fail, which was why he hadn't decided to stay in Earth's territory and had instead begun to make his way over immediately. However, what he hadn't expected was for this to lead to the eruption of a decades-long suppressed fury. The Morales family was intimately familiar with human nature. Taking a step back only made others think they had a license to take more. Last time, the Morales family had had no intention of taking the first step back, but Velasco hadn't cared enough to even fight for it. The result of that were enemies spotting a chink in their armor and taking out a man who had contributed a great deal to their succeed. These two things, Velasco's initial indifference, and his subsequent furious tirade, had caused no small amount of dissatisfaction within the family. But that was one matter, and this was another. It didn't matter to them who Lionel was, what lineage he was from. All that mattered was that he had Morales blood, and a step beyond that, that he was one of their potential heirs. The Morales family's reverse scale had already been poked at once, they wouldn't allow it to be poked out again. Ancestor Radrian found himself being suffocated. The Morales and the Omens might both be crafting families, but their skill in combat couldn't be compared. By the third exchange, Radrian was already on his back foot. By the 10th, beads of sweat were falling down his brow. The two old men who had appeared to protect Amory and Nazag frowned. However, almost the instant they twitched, the skies tore apart and two more older men wearing off-white robes appeared, standing above them. Without a word, they waved their palms and their spears appeared, howling spear force raging through the skies. By this point, the others could only be thankful that Cynthia had long since removed the gravity formation, or else their only fate would be to die. The expressions of Ancestor Suyard and Ancestor Terrius turned ugly. The Morales were truly serious about this. The both of them acted quickly, hiding their young geniuses behind them. Suddenly, they regretted trying to make a show of force by sending these two forward instead of a pair of elders. If Amory and Nazag died in this battle, it wouldn't be worth it at all. Cynthia's words about dead geniuses seemed oh so ironic at this point. Is there a need for this? Ancestor Suyard asked coldly, his gaze as sharp as a pair of twin swords. One of them, an elder who went by Ancestor Ramon, pointed the tip of his spear toward Ancestor Suyard, the battle intent in his gaze blazing. The Suyard family has long since been an eyesore. Slaughtering you here would make my blade sing. As though in response, Ancestor Ramon's spear vibrated wildly, the echo causing both Nazag and Amory to go pale. Ancestor Suyard sneered. The Morales family can't afford to do this, you have no idea what the Morales family can afford or not. I've been waiting decades to say this, but blood begets blood. I don't know who laid their hands on our brother Ishmael, but the human domain hasn't suffered nearly enough for that. Hearing this, Ancestor Suyard's expression only became uglier. If this was really the impetus for the Morales family's action, then they had had decades to think about this. In that time, they should have cooled off and let more rational thought win, but the opposite had happened instead. What kind of trump cards had they prepared for this? Just when Ancestor Ramon was about to attack and vent the chest full of fury he had suppressed for so long, a sudden change occurred. Boom! Yet another flagship appeared in the skies. Ancestor Ramon frowned. Shield cross stars? This thought only lasted for a moment, though. That was because on the bow of the ship, there was a boy sitting with his feet dangling among the stars, a boy whose face was recognizable to many by now. That was just an inevitable result when you were a Tier 1 fugitive. Lionel blinked, clearly not having expected to see such a shit show. This wasn't even his real body, it was just a clone he was using to direct the flagship. His true body was still having a grand time, though whether it was a clone or his real body didn't make much of a difference. After all, both were being controlled by the same mind. The hell? Lionel mumbled. The current Lionel really looked out of place. He was shirtless, wearing nothing but a comfortable pair of sweatpants. He couldn't be bothered to conjure up anything more complicated for a clone, but this only made things all the more shocking. Lionel's appearance, however, especially for those who thought that he had every intention of stalling and buying as much time as possible, caught many off guard, almost more than the fact he dared to appear with a stolen flagship of S.H.I.E.L.D. cross stars. Cynthia's gaze drifted over, her expression unreadable. Alejandro, who stood in the skies among crackling lightning, also turned over. In fact, even the various ancestors looked over. After all, this young man was the spark that had started all of this. Lionel blinked. He wasn't one to be shy, but this situation was truly quite weird to him. Coughing lightly, he smiled. Did I come at a bad time? The expressions of many became weird. Of all the responses they had expected, this was definitely the last. Lionel looked slightly uncomfortable, but outside of that, he didn't seem to feel the pressure of the situation at all. Adderworth smiled bitterly. Little bro, you really did come at a poor time. Oh? What happened? The conversation echoed across the battlefield, the rumbling of the Morales family warriors unable to suppress it entirely. It made sense for a seventh-dimensional expert like Adderworth to be able to do this, but Lionel being able to. Well. Adderworth looked around. Lionel's appearance seemed to have caused a small lull, but this couldn't be helped. The entire surrounded were still quaking due to the appearance of such a large war vessel. It was difficult even for eighth-dimensional existences to maintain perfect balance currently. It's like this. Adderworth decided it wouldn't do any harm to explain. He still wasn't a fan of the Morales doing this, although his blood also boiled. Lionel's brow raised after he listened to Adderworth. Is that all? Adderworth frowned, not quite sure how to respond to that. A year really is too long, by then he'll be in the seventh dimension. If we held the air wars then, it wouldn't have any suspense. What fun would that be? Lionel's smile was like the summer breeze, his hair dancing gently in a wind that seemed to be of his own creation. The carefree confidence he exuded seemed to sweep away all auras but his own. Chapter 1929. Published at 19th of June 2023, 10:53 and 35 seconds AM. Chapter 1929. Different if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Arrogant. For many of the older generation here, this was the very first time they were seeing Lionel. But that smile, that casualness, that indifference in the face of what should have been insurmountable pressure. They had seen it before. And he looked so similar to that person that their images could practically be stacked atop of one another and fused into one. For some reason, seeing Lionel's nonchalant smile, the fury in the eyes of the ancestors and Alejandro abetted, their gazes sparkling. Ancestor Alvaro's wrist trembled once, sending Ancestor Radrian flying back with quite some speed toward the Omen family's flagship. Then, he raised his head to the skies and laughed uproariously, his laughter echoing all throughout the battlefield. In truth, the ancestors of the Morales family weren't entirely on board with this. Setting aside the fact that they were still quite furious, Lionel's words just now might have helped them vent somewhat, but the issue was that it could easily backfire. If Lionel actually won, or performed well enough, then his words now would gain them back quite a bit of face. However, if Lionel said all of this just to lose, and in terrible fashion at that, then it would only be worse for the Morales family from then on. Starting the war right here and now was preferable for multiple reasons. For one, there was the matter of momentum. Scheming and planning was just as important in war as the charisma of one's leaders and the heart of one's warriors. The morale of the troops was an often forgotten staple of victory. Only the most foolish of commanders would treat their armies like numbers on a sheet. Right this moment, the momentum was on the side of the Morales. If they chose to take a step back, gathering up the fire they had in their bellies currently would be very difficult. The second reason was even more obvious, and that was because they could deal a decisive blow to all of their enemies right here and now. There were 3 ancestors present, 3 men that these families would ache to lose. And beyond that, there was Cynthia, a talent the likes of which only Velasco had ever been able to suppress. If she was crippled or even killed, this was a blow that the Oman family would find incredibly difficult to deal with. The one thing the Oman family lacked was powerful combat power. If Cynthia grew to the point of her ancestors, one would be hard-pressed to defeat her without dozens at the same level. On the other hand, if Lionel won despite the odds stacked against him and became the new patriarch of the Morales family, things would change. The war felt inevitable at this point, but the momentum they would have in this latter case would be even more than what they had now, not to mention the fact that they would also gain the support of Earth at the same time. While that might not be worth much now, in the future, the gain in morale and momentum, not to mention the suppression of the other families, would result in nothing but benefits. If this future was guaranteed, it would definitely be the preferred path, especially since if Lionel became the patriarch, that lone wolf Velasco wouldn't be able to be so casual with his actions any longer and he might finally return like he should have long ago. Truthfully, it was only because Velasco's movements, whereabouts, and current strength were so unknown that these families chose to be so bold. Some thought he was beneath Cynthia after spending so long on Earth and thus wasn't a worry at all. Some thought he was at best equivalent to Cynthia, making him a slight worry, but nothing much in the grand scheme. Very few knew his real strength. If not because of the event that occurred in the Void Palace, these people would have been even more casual. Humans were forgetful creatures. The Morales ancestors didn't know if Lionel realized these truths or if he was just speaking like a normal hot-blooded youth. If it was the latter, it was acceptable enough. He had proved himself to be a Morales. If it was the former, however, this boy was no less arrogant than his father. "Boy, do you know what you are asking for?" Ancestor Alvaro looked down with a smile. He was one of the elders who disliked Velasco greatly, but he didn't seem to transfer that dislike toward Lionel at all. Lionel looked up and smiled, but he didn't seem to feel like answering. He had made his stance quite clear. Ancestor Alvaro nodded once and his gaze suddenly became malevolent, a suffocating pressure falling down toward Lionel. "Will you win?" The voice cracked like thunder and rumbled like an earthquake. Those in the distance who thought that they had put enough of a gap between themselves and the battlefield suddenly exploded back in retreat once again, coughing up large amounts of blood. Despite the fact that the voice was aimed toward him, Lionel's smile didn't fade. "Winning is all I do." Lionel's voice was much softer than Alvaro's, but it was just as clearly heard, riding the waves and projecting to the world. Ancestor Alvaro's malevolent expression slowly faded and he nodded one final time. "Sheeing." At that moment, the sound of a howling sword force also rose. Amory, who stood behind his ancestor, looked toward Lionel with his same indifferent glance. He slowly unsheathed a sword, the howling only becoming louder and louder as he pulled it from its sheath. Ancestor Alvaro looked toward this with an indifferent gaze. If Lionel couldn't deal with this much, then there wasn't much of a point to allowing him to participate in the first place. In fact, seeing this, it was Ancestor Suyard who frowned, but it was already too late to stop him. If he did, he would be dampening his own family genius momentum. "All you do is win?" "I seem to remember different." Amory's sword fully unsheathed, a howling sword force splitting the air in two as he surged toward Lionel. Chapter 1930. Published at 19th of June 2023 10:53 and 19 seconds AM. Chapter 1930. Belong. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The sword howl caused many to narrow their gazes. Even amongst the weaker older generation, they felt the need to take this attack seriously. They couldn't fathom how someone in the 6th dimension could possibly deal with such a strike. In fact, they didn't know many 7th dimensional existences in Tier 1 that could deal with it, not without ending up in a sorry mess, that is. However, Lionel's smile didn't fade. In fact, he didn't even move. A shadow seemed to appear from Lionel's side. James seemed to come from nowhere. Placing a foot on the rail of the flagship, he reached out a palm toward the coming sword blade. Many frowned when they saw this, did this young man want to lose his hand? But something most couldn't have expected occurred. Bang! James' fingers clawed downward, grabbing the golden sword force and squeezing down. The sound of shattering glasses echoed as the sword force dispersed into a whirlwind, the bits and shards echoing into the distance. Many stunned gazes landed on James. His hand was uninjured, there wasn't even the slightest scratch on it. It seemed that he had casually dealt with it without even the slightest discomfort. How rude, James clicked his tongue. What are you doing attacking a clone like that? If you're mad, wait till you're face to face. Doing things like this just makes you seem petty. It was only after James said it that everyone seemed to realize that the current Lionel lacked something. This wasn't something others could normally see through, but with the number of eighth-dimensional existences here, there were no small number of them that could see the difference. Fooling the eyes of such experts was especially difficult, especially when they knew what they were looking for. It was no wonder they couldn't sense Lionel's exact tier. Most had assumed that he was speaking nonsense when he said that he could enter the seventh dimension in a year. But if his clone was powerful to the extent of fooling so many eyes, then what about his real body? But even more importantly than that, Amory was a genius that many knew of. In fact, he was well known as the first since Velasco and Cynthia to be at such a level. So who was this young man who could resolve his attack with a hand? Just as many were lost in thought, another figure suddenly appeared. It was a young woman with a body filled with hidden and explosive muscles. She appeared by Lionel's side with a hint of fury in her eyes, her hair fluttering with blade force. Emna reached a finger forward and tapped at the air. At that moment, a blade howl the likes of which didn't seem to lose out to Amory in the slightest appeared, concentrating on her fingertip with a radiant golden light. Amory's eyes narrowed, however an instant later, his pupils constricted. Without hesitation, he unsheathed his second blade, taking a step forward and swinging. Bang! Bang! Amory's arms trembled and he was forced to take a step back. His eyes widened and released a low roar, his aura flourishing as he resolved the attack. Even so, he was forced to take yet another step back. James winced. Oof, that's a little bit embarrassing. Amory had attacked Lionel, and yet the result was one of Lionel's men resolving it with ease, and a second one of Lionel's men forcing him back. For someone who had such an undefeated legend, if this wasn't embarrassing, then nothing else could be. The worst part was that no one seemed to recognize who these two people were. They were complete unknowns and only one of them seemed to have the aura of Earth, something the powerhouses were only now becoming familiar with. That meant that using Earth as an excuse didn't seem to be enough. Emna didn't seem satisfied, and wanted to attack again, but before she could, Lionel raised a hand. Seeing this, Emna didn't hesitate to take a step back, her obedience making the striking difference all the more obvious. Ancestor Alvaro nodded inwardly. It seemed that there was a difference between Lionel and his father after all. While they were both extremely arrogant, Velasco was not a leader and never had an interest in it. Lionel, however, it seemed that he was quite capable. You remember different, hmm? Lionel smiled. Funny words coming from someone who couldn't withstand a few arrows. Amory stabilized himself, his gaze still tranquil as he looked up toward Lionel. Amory stabilized himself, his gaze still tranquil as he looked up toward Lionel. But I don't really feel like rehashing the past. Since everyone is here, I think that there's something far more important to talk about, don't you think? What compensation do you all plan to give me? The eyes of many narrowed, the atmosphere falling into silence. Nothing? Lionel chuckled. Feigning ignorance is fine if your goal is to only seem more like a worthless bunch of elitists, even more so than your actions today would suggest. None of you find it funny that the geniuses you're sending forward to participate in the heirs' wars wouldn't even be here to participate if not for me? The Morales family shares my blood and they don't hesitate to step out to protect me. But what are the rest of you worth to me? By this point, it was all too obvious what Lionel was referring to. Faced with this, there was little they could say. It's funny. I should have returned a hero, but the first thing that happened to me when I returned to the Void Palace was an interrogation and pressure to hand in a method that was mine to begin with. Fine, that much is fine. My research and results could be game-changing for the human domain. I might be inclined to help out if the feeling was reciprocated. But not long after that, Shield Cross Stars came to arrest me as though I truly was a fugitive. As though that wasn't enough, I'm also now suddenly a ticking time bomb that needs to be dealt with just because I have Fox and Morales blood coursing within me. Lionel's smile suddenly faded, a dense violet fog exuding from him and enveloping the flagship. My patience is very limited and my temper isn't good. I'll tell you all right now, since you don't want to acknowledge the fact so many of you owe your lives to me, I'll keep count of the debt myself. I don't have a need for your pity. I'll collect those debts back one by one. If you dare to send your geniuses in, I'll dare to kill them. If you send in one, I will kill one. If you send in 10, I will kill 10. As many come as many as you'll lose. Consider it as a repayment of your debt. Your lives belong to me to begin with. Lionel rose to his feet. These people thought that he was some sort of live target that they could casually hunt. It was only right that they came to understand how he saw things, that they came to understand the reality of things. He wasn't the prey, they were. He wasn't the hunted, they were. He was half Morales but no less of a madman. There might, potentially, be no third chapter today. If there is one, it will be much, much later. I will try my best, sorry everyone. This month and next month will be quite hectic for me. Chapter 1931. Published at 19th of June 2023 10:53 and 11 seconds AM. Chapter 1931. Question: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel stood up with a calm expression on his face. He hadn't said these words for the sake of these people feeling remorse, that would be nothing short of naive. He didn't want anything from these people. In fact, if they folded now and acquiesced to such a demand, it would only disappoint him. This fury in his belly had to be directed somewhere, and he wanted the target to be solid, not some soft cloud. He understood human psychology well. Doing something might be impactful, but saying you would do something and then doing it would be doubly so. He wanted these people to feel suffocated, he wanted them to watch their geniuses with despair clear on their faces, and yet feel somewhere deep within their hearts that it was all their fault from the very beginning. Lionel swept a gaze over the surroundings. He could see the various responses to his words. Some were enraged, some sneered, some didn't bother to hide their disdain. However, regardless of the reaction, he met it calmly, his own confidence shining through. His eyes landed on Cynthia for a moment before he turned away and moved to return toward his flagship. This woman, he was glad she was unscathed. If she was acting out of some sort of animosity, it would be his mother who put her in her place. As Lionel clone dissipated, the uproarious laughter of the three Morales ancestors echoed through the skies. You've heard the brat. A month from now, those of you who still dare can make your way to the execution grounds. Ancestor Alvaro took a step and vanished after saying these words. Like this, the domain war was cut short before it truly came into being. All those present knew that things wouldn't end so simply, and that at this point, war was practically inevitable. These heirs' wars had suddenly gone from a method of potentially avoiding war to a fight for momentum. Whoever came out on top would have an upper hand when the pot finally began to boil over. A day later, Lionel walked into a grand hall holding Ana's hand. He looked up, craning his neck just to catch a glimpse of a ceiling that must have been at least 100 meters up. He had never been in such a grand place and he had to admit that the crafting specialty of the Morales family truly shone here. He smiled lightly and looked forward, meeting Patriarch Alejandro's gaze. Alejandro smiled widely and he seemed to be in a very good mood, a far cry from the mood he had been in recent months. There was a point where he just wanted to leave and start a massacre of his own, but duty and responsibility weighed him down quite heavily. Littlest Nova, you wanted to see me? Alejandro asked. Ah, and this is Ana Brazinger, I gather? Look at this, Adderworth. Lionel has already found his life partner, and what about you? You're almost double his age by now and still single. What am I going to do with you? Adworth coughed. It wasn't that he didn't like women, but the one he wanted a bit stubborn. There wasn't much he could do about this. He wasn't as lucky as Lionel. Seeing that he had done his parental duty of embarrassing his son in front of company, Alejandro laughed heartily and invited Lionel and Ana forward. I did want to see you, Lionel said with a smile, bringing out the segmented cube and the spear domain ring. These two things are heirlooms of the Morales family. My old man is a bit unruly, so I can imagine how these things landed in his hand, but I believe that for the sake of fairness, these things should be given back to the family during the heir wars. It won't be too late for me to reclaim them later. Alejandro's brows shot up. Of all the things he had expected, this was the very last. Lionel wasn't scheming with this move, he truly felt that it was only right. The only reason he didn't think of doing this earlier was because he had, indeed, started at a disadvantage. The other heirs had all grown up under the umbrella of the Morales, whereas his dad didn't tell him anything about this world until he was already 18, and even then that lazy old man had left him to his own devices. So, Lionel didn't feel bad for having had them in the first place. But now that the heir wars were here, he thought it was only right he temporarily hand them over. However, what Adworth didn't expect was for Alejandro to suddenly shake his head. While it can be said that these two treasures are heirlooms of our family, it's probably more accurate to say that they are heirlooms of your family's branch. This is especially so for the segmented cube. The spear domain ring has had many owners, but the segmented cube has always belonged to Ishmael's lineage. It doesn't even listen to anyone else. Lionel raised his brows. He hadn't expected this. Plus, I can tell that you've already passed the tribulation of the spear domain ring, so actually, you are its rightful owner now. The only thing you owe the family is a recounting of your experience in the tribulation ground for future generations. Other than that, you're free to keep it. Seeing Lionel's surprise, Alejandro chuckled. Your father didn't explain anything, right? That's just like him. Ana giggled to the side, clearly amused by Lionel getting a taste of his own medicine. Lionel smiled bitterly, but inwardly he actually felt quite warm. He had already decided before that the Morales family would be his, but as things stood currently, he felt more a part of them than anything else. If there's nothing else, you can have dinner with us tonight if you would like. My wife has been wanting to meet you. Lionel smiled to accept, but his gaze flashed instead, suddenly thinking of something. There is one more thing that I've been wondering about. Why is it that I feel that the moniker of madman isn't a coincidence? And why does it seem that this only becomes more true the older a Morales is? Lionel had very few data points to reach this conclusion. He had interacted with too few Morales, but everything he did know seemed to point to this one conclusion. For one, the Morales tended to have very young patriarchs. If the heir wars had occurred at the proper time, they would have been less than 35 years old. In the dimensional verse, this was exceptionally young considering even fifth-dimensional existences in their 70s looked as though they were in their 20s. There was logically no reason to rush this. Secondly, on the battlefield just a day ago, Lionel had sensed a certain fury coming from the Morales ancestors, and Alejandro that, while could be considered reasonable, also felt somewhat irrational. It was incredibly difficult to maintain such fury for such extended periods of time, but the Morales didn't seem to have any issues with this. And finally, maybe the reason Lionel thought there might be such a possibility, there was the crimson energy that had seeped into his body the day he awakened his metal synergy lineage factor. Hearing this question, Alejandro's brows shot up, looking toward Lionel with a deep gaze. Chapter 1932. Published at 19th of June 2023, 10:53 and 5 seconds AM. Chapter 1932. Only time. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Alejandro stayed silent for a long while. It would be one thing if Lionel asked this question based on something Velasco had said, but he knew that man too well. And considering Lionel had just tried to give over something he shouldn't have, it was safe to say that his level of understanding toward the family was nearly zero. This meant that Lionel had deduced this on his own from the outside. Alejandro wasn't sure if this was impressive or maybe even a bit said. It is true that the Morales have a bit of a temper problem, but it's usually not much of a problem. It used to be much worse, but after a certain age, the elders and ancestors of the family enter the Holy Land where the incense can calm their minds and soothe their soul. The reality is that the ability to assimilate the elements with your body is a demonic ability. For humans, the root of our affinities should be our ethereal glabellas. However, the metal synergy lineage factor takes root in the blood and the affinity is birthed from runes that are ground into our bones and flesh. This is far more comparable to demons whose affinities are rooted in their bodies. Lionel's gaze flashed. That was true, now that he thought about it. When Aina refined the force pills to refine their foundations, the most important aspect was the flesh and blood of the demons. They had already been the foundation of the strength of demons. Lionel had never really seen things from that perspective, but indeed, the metal synergy lineage factor truly did align much more with demons than it did humans. His mind couldn't help but drift to the Demoness once again and the connection between the Silver Empire's inheritance and that of the Morales families. Was it a coincidence? Or could it be that Demoness wasn't just referring to the personality of this mysterious woman, but also her race? How were these things related, though? Just the timelines alone didn't seem to match up. If the Demoness was related to everything, she would have had to have been there from the start of the Morales family to this point. The same would have been true for the other two founders of the Three-Finger Cult as well. Even someone with a Tier 5 Immortality Ability Index couldn't live that long. Wise Star Order had made it obvious many times that his lifespan was actually quite limited. And even if the Demoness had a Tier 5 Immortality Ability Index that was somehow beyond that of any savant ever born before and she really had lived for so long, what about the current head of the Three-Finger Cult? He was still alive as well. Was Lionel supposed to believe that two such anomalies were born into the same generation with the exact same ability index? What were the odds of that? It was all very confusing and even he couldn't piece together what was happening. But Lionel started, but didn't quite know how to put it. Did demons have ingrained anger problems? He hadn't personally experienced this, at least not from intelligent demons. The Cobra demon was actually quite calm and calculating, and Kaldar had actually been quite funny when he did speak, although Lionel was pretty sure he still seriously believed that the former swung for the same team. And also, even if they did, why did it seem based on age? There are always consequences for going against the natural order of things. You've probably also noticed the other oddity in our lineage factor, that being that it unlocks in stages. Rather than being at a set level from the very beginning like most other lineage factors, it requires being unlocked over time. There's a reason it's like that, our bodies wouldn't be able to handle it all at once. Lionel's gaze flickered, this was also true. Though, he no longer had this problem. After assimilating the Silver Empire's inheritance, he had access to the full range of the metal synergy lineage factor, though, it probably wasn't appropriate to call it that any longer as the synergy it had with the other three portions had created something entirely new that Lionel had yet to fully explore. On top of that, he had formed a sixth doorway that would allow his metal synergy lineage factor to cross from the 8th dimension into the 9th. But as things stood now, he had no idea how to open that doorway. At the very least, right now, he felt like he was a very far distance from it. Lionel had yet to battle with this new body of his because he had to enter the tribulation right afterward. In truth, he was a bit eager to see where his limits lay, but that was a matter for another time. Although we don't know the exact reasons, we can only guess that this is a large part of it. Lionel felt that this explanation was more than enough. In Earth's past, there was something colloquially known as mad cow disease. This was a disease caused when humans ingested cow brain, but more accurately, it was caused by a particular fold of protein found within the meat. This disease was named as such because of all of the cognitive changes it could cause in both cows and humans, even to the point of changing one's personality entirely. If something as relatively simple as a protein, at least compared to an entire lineage factor, could cause a thing, then forcing something decidedly not human into a human form factor was bound to have its own consequences. Lionel had already seen lineage factors casually make changes to his brain on a macro scale through the spear domain lineage factor. What was happening on a micro scale that he had missed? But beyond that, The real question was, by completing the inheritance, did Lionel save himself from such a fate? Or did he just consign himself to damnation? Only time would tell. Chapter 1933. Published at 19th of June 2023 10:53 and 2 seconds AM. Chapter 1933, Novas. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The next month flew by fast. Lionel felt incomparably relaxed. He spent his days in leisure. From the outside it was difficult to tell that he should have been the person experiencing the most pressure. When the day came, however, he awoke with a sharp coldness in his eyes. He bathed, meticulously cleaning every inch of his body. He ate, eating through tables worth of food as though he would never be satiated. Then, he dressed himself, wrapping himself in robes of violet and gold. When he stepped out of the segmented cube, he found his queen with a dignified expression on her face. Aina wore a long violet and gold dress that clung to her curves and had just a single slit down its right side, revealing a creamy smooth thigh wrapped with a delicate lace garter. Aina smiled lightly, stepping forward and smoothing out Lionel's chest. Her hair and eyes seemed to sparkle on their own, emitting a gentle light. When she seemed satisfied, she took his arm, and they stepped out together. The atmosphere was incomparably solemn. Not a single sound could be heard despite the seemingly endless pair of eyes paying attention to the situation. The location was a space above a seemingly barren planet. There wasn't a single blade of grass on its gray body, nor was there a single sign of life. Above it, there was a platform formed entirely of glass. On this clear platform, a large number of youths stood in pairs. One would have thought that Lionel's threat had fallen entirely on deaf ears. Surrounding this clear platform, several flagship-level ships were in attendance. Any power of the human domain worth much of anything was present, even if they had no intention of participating. There were no doubt powerhouses of the Void Palace and Shield Cross stars present. As for those that couldn't make it, the Morales had made certain that they had a chance to watch. They wanted the entire human domain to witness this event. It might be surprising that the participating youths were only standing in pairs rather than having their entire entourages with them, but this was how every air war began. Only by completing tasks would one gain access to more of their allies, and if you failed too soon, you may never get to display your full strength at all. In the center of these participants, 6 of the 7 heirs stood, each one with a pre-selected target. There wasn't a single one of them that didn't look prepared for battle, their gazes sharp and their aurasa piercing. Adderworth, First Nova. A bronzed armor covered his body, the maturity between his brows clear for all to see. In these years, he had managed to rein in much of the stalwart polearm legacy faction under his control. If he had been given some more time, there was no doubt that he would have returned it to the status of a party and maybe even a leading majority. Surprisingly, though, to his side, there wasn't a member of this faction, his supposed strongest backing. Rather, there was a young woman that was recognizable by all, a young beauty that was most definitely on the Queen Beauty list and someone that Aina would recognize quite intimately. This young woman was none other than Vega Aquarius. The appearance of this woman by Adderworth's side was a huge surprise. The Aquarius family was a constellation family, and as such had sent geniuses to represent them. But rather than siding with her family, Vega had actually made such a decision. Oren, Second Nova. He seemed to stand in the shadows along with his partner whose face was entirely obscured. In fact, even Oren's face itself seemed impossible to see. He was without a doubt the most mysterious of the 6, but this only made sense as he was known to have the widest information network. Covertness was the name of his game. Zavnik, Third Nova. Although his gaze was sharp, there was a confident smile on his face. That interaction he had had with Second Nova all those years ago felt like a lifetime ago. Only he understood his reason for working with the unfettered Blade Party back then. To his side, though, an inconspicuous and unknown young man stood, shrouded in just as much secrecy as Oren's partner. Sio, Fourth Nova. He was without a doubt the most erratic of them all. He had even tried to place Aina under a slave contract many years ago. But this was in line with his personality. Considering Vega was by Adderworth's side currently but Sio had been chasing her for a long while, it was clear that scruples weren't something this fourth Nova had. Even so, the current Sio seemed to have undergone a striking change. The transformation was almost perfect, if it wasn't for the fact Vega's vice captain was currently by his side as his chosen partner. With that, the Morales heirs had already monopolized 2 queen beauties for themselves. Ramon, 5th Nova. If 2nd Nova was the most covert, Ramon was the most silent and also the only one of the 6 that Lionel had never heard of. Ramon wore a pair of glasses and his appearance was the least confident of the 6. However, by his side, there was a valiant woman who seemed to exude all the aura that was needed for the both of them. This woman was yet another queen beauty, making that 3. However, she wasn't from another family. No, she was from the previous Nebula generation, the littlest Nebula, and was a Morales through and through. Of all the surprises of this day, the appearance of Valerie Morales was maybe the greatest. Valor, 6th Nova. The most stoic of the 6 and also the one to enter the 7th dimension the most recently. By his side, a man stood in silence, his eyes half closed. At first glance, it was difficult to tell which of them was the more stoic of the 2, and maybe that was exactly why they worked together so well. This young man was well known as the sector-ranked disciple closest to becoming the next domain reigned. Bruno, his last name unknown. At that moment, a flagship up above shuddered and a young man and woman wrapped in violet and gold stepped out. Chapter 1934. Published at 19th of June 2023 10:53 and 1 a.m. Chapter 1934. No words if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The difference was striking. Everyone was prepared for war. As far as the eye could see, there were armors, sharpened blades, gauntlets and pauldrons galore, and yet Lionel and Aina appeared as though they were strolling to a gala. No matter who it was, even those that would have the intention of directly ignoring him from the very start, they all couldn't help but look. In this sea of 7th dimensional experts, there were only 2 in the 6th dimension, and both of them were right before their eyes. Lionel hadn't chosen to bring one of his 7th dimensional guards. Instead, he had chosen to bring his queen, his wife, his woman. Bold. Unrestrained. Arrogant. As he strolled forward, a radiant halo seemed to form above his head, a suffocating presence exuding from him. Despite the fact that he was clearly in the 6th dimension, his momentum seemed to suppress all those around him, but what was even more surprising was that the gorgeous woman by his side carried an air of dignity and majesty that was no less oppressive. Golden forces seemed to appear and vanish around Lionel just as quickly. He descended through the depths of space with fluttering steps, this golden force forming flying doves and gliding butterflies. It was such a magical scene that it took even 8th dimensional existences several seconds before they realized that this golden force was actually spear force. Their pupils couldn't help but constrict. They had never fathomed that spear force could be used in this way. It was alive, breathing. It was beautiful and seemed to lack the edge of blood and carnage that a spear should have had, and yet it was no less intimidating. In fact, it was more so. Lionel and Aina landed on the glass platform, causing it to tremble. Any thoughts of obstructing their path forward seemed to vanish into the air, the geniuses that should have been here to participate and compete with them flowing out of the way one after another. Neither Lionel nor Aina seemed to spare them a single glance as though their actions only made sense. At this moment, Lionel's Tier 7 aura had flourished completely, entering the senses of those in the surroundings. However, rather than sneering at such a thing, their hearts could only leap into their throats. A year really is too long, by then I'll be in the 7th dimension. Those words should have been nonsense, they should have been something that could be dismissed with the wave of a hand, but the reality made this far from the case. Not even a year ago, Lionel was only at Tier 1, and yet he was already at Tier 7 now. Lionel appeared within the central circle of novas. There wasn't a single hint of a smile on his face, his king's might flourishing in all directions. He had never been more focused in his life, and the result was a pressure more suffocating than anything he had ever exuded before, a pressure which, just like always, seemed to be something only Aina was entirely indifferent to. In fact, Aina's own presence seemed to fuse and multiply Lionel's own, the resonance between the two of them causing the force in the air to fluctuate and disperse. The weaker parties suddenly found that controlling their force, even within their bodies, had become extraordinarily difficult. The appearance of two sovereigns was more than what they could handle. The eyes of the elders and various ancestors standing on their ships narrowed. Lionel's words from just a month ago seemed to echo in their ears once more. The Morales ancestors looked down with sparkling gazes, their blood rushing through their veins and their bronzed skin flushing red like melting metal. Oh, how they wished to be young once more. Lionel's statement couldn't have been more clear. His attire spoke volumes, and it was a statement that was ringing throughout the entire human domain. The others were warriors, he was a king. The others had come to fight, he had come for glory. The others hoped for victory, he had come to pass judgment. To him, the outcome was already clear. Hugo, Ancestor Alvaro said lightly. There was no need for any more words. Seeing the look in Lionel's eyes, it was clear that he was finished talking. He hadn't even looked toward his fellow Nova brothers even a single time. As his spear force continued to form life around him, it seemed that he was all too eager for his blade to taste blood. Ancestor Hugo stepped forward, spreading his hands out wide as his aura flourished. He was a man who looked like he had a foot in the grave, even his balding head was covered in dark age spots. Even so, when he moved, the world seemed to move with him, the momentum of an eighth-dimensional powerhouse flowing out like a tsunami. A dense dream force pervaded the region and descended upon the glass platform. Lionel stood in silence, closing his eyes lightly. Even when closed, he could sense the countless gazes on him. Many were filled with apprehension and fear, but there was a good number who had unwillingness, rage and fury in their eyes. Without even using his internal sight, he could feel the changes in their emotions as though they were being imprinted on his very soul. Lionel slowly opened his eyes once more, a rippling ring of violet sweeping out from him. When these air wars concluded, no one in his generation would dare to look at him with such a gaze. Whoosh! All of the youth vanished at once. When Lionel opened his eyes, he found himself in a wilderness, but the region was quite poor. The soil wasn't rich, and was in fact quite cracked and lifeless. The air was dry and hot with the sun beating down from above, it didn't seem like there had been any rain in months. Looking down at his clothes, he wore nothing but a simple linen shirt and pants. If he wanted access to what he had been wearing previously, he would have to likewise complete tasks. Lionel looked toward Aina who was by his side, wearing clothes just as simple and yet looking just as beautiful. Let's go, he said lightly. Chapter 1935. Published at 19th of June 2023 10:52 and 55 seconds AM. Chapter 1935. Village. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Aina nodded and followed after Lionel who shot into the distance. He didn't hold back on his speed at all, leaving trails of spatial force, light force and star force in his wake. The Air Wars was the final test of the Morales, and it was treated and designed as such. Not only were your preparations being tested, but your skill was being tested. In the beginning, what you had done in the outside world was almost meaningless and would only begin to snowball as the Air Wars continued. The only thing you would have access to is your original and raw strength. Lionel suddenly reached out a hand. At that moment, a bow began to appear in his hands. At the same time, a golden battle axe appeared before Aina, one that she didn't hesitate to grab. The linen clothing fluttered in the wind as they appeared before a small village. The walls that protected the small village were made of bundled wood that looked as though they would be better used in a small fire. It was barely 30 or so meters across in diameter and it seemed to already be in a state of lockdown as though the appearance of Lionel and Alna had already been expected. Lionel exerted strength in his feet and shot into the skies, appearing high in the trees and surpassing them. Just when it seemed that he would fall back down, a spatial platform appeared beneath his feet and he pulled back the string of his bow. At the same time, barefoot and all, Aina whipped by an afterimage of his that was still on the ground. In a blink, she had already appeared by the gates of the small village, her gaze cold. On the outside of the air wars, everything seemed to have changed. The barren moon below had become lush and vibrant. At the same time, the glass platform began to flicker, subtly moving. At that moment, it became obvious that it wasn't a platform, but rather a perfectly glass cube that one could see through perfectly. At that moment, however, the glass cube flickered, images of all sorts appearing. An odd force art seemed to make it possible for the glass cube to function as any individual's personal entertainment station. Even so, almost everyone focused on the exact same thing at the first sign of choice. Lionel. Watching him break out into a sprint immediately, the silence was loud. There was nothing wrong with this choice, but there was nothing right about it either. In addition, it was oddly confident for someone who was in the sixth dimension. The challenges and enemies of the air wars were all set to a seventh-dimensional standard. They had all felt that Lionel was foolish to begin with. Taking another sixth-dimensional existence in with him instead of a seventh-dimensional one was the pinnacle of foolishness. That said, if he could leverage the statement, he could come out on top, but he would have to target the appropriate challenges first. Running around like a headless chicken wasn't the right way. He hadn't even properly scanned his region yet. The eyes of the spectators narrowed further when Lionel summoned weapons from thin air. He shouldn't have any treasures on him right now, which meant he manifested those. The cube transmitted all information, including auras. Sensing the emulation spatial force Lionel was using, their gazes narrowed. A coincidence? Someone mumbled. Lionel and Aina had barely crossed 10 kilometers when they came across the village. But those that were sharp realized that Lionel had run in a perfectly straight line without even the slightest deviation. This realization was shocking. In order to take into consideration the larger number of participants and the relatively small arena, internal sight and abilities of the like were extremely suppressed. A normal seventh-dimensional existence would barely be able to sense around 20 meters around themselves. Someone who specialized in sensory perception could probably hit around 100 meters, and only an absolute genius in the field would be able to approach half a kilometer to a kilometer. This was only proven by the state the others were in. They were entirely focused on slowly scouting out their territory and feeling out their surroundings. The only one who had acted as Lionel had was, well, Lionel. He can't be. Many frowned. All challenges were set to the level of the seventh dimension. Lionel and Aina rushing toward the village like this and not taking a detour. It was clear and obvious. This was their goal from the very beginning. Aina swung her battle axe with a naked abandon. From the skies above, Lionel had already released his arrow. In perfect sync, her blade and his arrow descended at once. The gate was shattered into a fluttering mass of raining wood chips. By the time this happened, Lionel had already released his second arrow, and then the third. Two troll-like beasts standing at 2 meters tall appeared to the left and right of Aina instantly, each one exuding the aura of a Tier 1 seventh-dimensional existence. Aina's feet pivoted, her hips torquing as he battle-axe descended from the skies and toward the head of the first. Lionel's arrow appeared in that instant. Their forces resonated and the attack strength suddenly exploded forth. The troll couldn't even react before it was split in two, the two halves of its body seemingly imploded as they were crushed to pieces by the residual strength. The blood seemed to avoid Aina entirely, almost as though it was too scared to blemish her. Her second swing flowed from the first one and Lionel's third arrow appeared just as quickly. The two, blade and arrow, seemed to become attached to one another by a mysterious force, amplifying and strengthening one another. PCHU. The second troll beast was shredded to pieces. Aina and Lionel were entirely in sync. From start to finish, not even 5 minutes passed, but the village had already been cleared. The human domain fell into silence. Chapter 1936. Published at 19th of June 2023 10:52 and 54 seconds AM. Chapter 1936. Headquarters. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel descended from the skies, landing by Aina. The two walked into the central building of the village and found a floating cube. Lionel grabbed forward and claimed the cube. A ripple spread out. In order to summon people, you needed to kill. Aina and he had cleared about exactly 37 people, not having allowed even a single one of them to escape. However, these 37 people, or rather trolls, were also worth points. This was to say that kills could always summon people or be used as points, but points could not. Lionel gained an additional point total for claiming the village, an additional multiplier for being the first, and yet another multiplier for difficulty and speed. For this lowest level primitive village, he went from 10 points to 100 points instantly. Lionel confirmed without hesitation. This region actually wasn't all that great. It lacked resources, the trees were quite sparse, the land was dry, but he didn't seem to give a damn. He gained another 100 points for being the first to establish his headquarters. Then, without even taking a pause, he converted all of their kills to points. Calling the trolls Tier 1 existences was incorrect. Rather, it was more accurate to call them subgrade threats. The ranking system for the air wars went subgrade, bronze grade, silver grade, gold grade, air threat. The rewards were 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, and 100,000 respectively, not including any multipliers. Simply put, this allowed Lionel to gain an extra 370 points instantly. Like this, he now had 570 points, and he needed exactly 500 to upgrade this village from subgrade to bronze grade. No one even had time to react to his absolutely insane choice before the village flashed with a blinding light and expanded. Ready? Lionel turned to Aina. Aina nodded. She didn't seem to have shed even a single bead of sweat. The two moved at once and then appeared on the growing walls of the now bronze-grade village. Rather than being formed of the bundles of wood, they instead became strong mud walls dug into deep trenches. But at that moment, enemies began to appear over the horizon, charging over. Every one of them was a bronze-grade threat. However, to even more surprise, rather than working together like they had before, Lionel and Aina separated, Lionel taking the north and Aina taking the south. Aina appeared by the pile of 37 troll bits and pieces. With a raise of her hand, the blood rose into the skies and began to burn with a blinding light. At that moment, all the energy and potential the trolls had ever had were forced out all at once, 37 phantoms appearing to her back. At the same time, without even looking, Lionel raised his own hands, the souls of the trolls being plucked out of the air outside of their control. In that instant, the king and queen duo had turned 37 subgrade threats into 74. To make matters more shocking, in Aina's hands, although they would only last a short while, they could now output bronze-grade strength with explosive power. Silence reigned. Watching two six-dimensional existences treat bronze-grade threats as though meat to a grinder was something that was difficult to comment on. The thoughts had gone from believing that Lionel must be suicidal, to suddenly choking on air. After seeing this, however, the tension in the hearts of the Morales ancestors slowly vanished. If things were like this, then there truly was no need to worry any longer. All they had to do was lean back and watch the show. It was a bit amusing watching a Morales heir use the bow so efficiently. Just glancing at the sternness on the faces of the Constellation Bow Alliance, Ancestor Alvaro couldn't help but burst out into laughter, breaking the silence. Look at your face, Mito. Did you eat a pile of shit on the way here? Ancestor Mito's expression darkened, but he didn't say a single thing. Thinking about the fact the white lion bow was in Lionel's hands, how could his expression not be like this? A Morales who didn't even care to use the spear, how unlucky. You're laughing too early, Mito sneered. The bronze-grade trial was wiped clean. The death total this time was 121, instantly giving Lionel and Aina 100 points instantly. If it was up to Lionel, he would upgrade to silver grade instantly, but unfortunately the price for an upgrade was 50,000 points this time, a huge leap. It was clear that the bronze grade was a gimme, the rest would be far more difficult. Even so, Lionel had clearly already expected this. The rate for exchange was simple. People were exchanged with kills, and as for items you had placed within the exchange ahead of time, they were graded on the same scale. Luckily, because they were your items, they were on a discount. Subgrade items only cost 1 point, bronze grade only cost 10 points, so on and so forth. Air grade items were an umbrella grade for all top-tier treasures that fell off of the scale. This would include the segmented cube and other things. The issue with this system was that when you summoned your people in exchange for points, you would also have to trade for their items. If you had trade for your treasures, and that of your thousands of subordinates, just how many points would you have to waste just outfitting your people with the capability for combat? The answer was too much. However, there was a very obvious loophole. All raw materials were counted as subgrade regardless of their true in real-life grade up to 100 kilograms. Lionel spent 10,000 points and summoned the segmented cube. With a flash of light, it descended from the skies. Then, using every bit of his remaining 2,170 points, he traded for just as many materials. All materials used in the trials had to be registered ahead of time, whether that was people or raw materials. As such, hiding items wasn't allowed. However, using the lab setting of the segmented cube to use these raw materials to search out treasures was very much allowed. And, setting the blueprint for these treasures before the air wars so that he didn't have to waste time crafting for himself right now was also very much allowed. Lionel tossed the raw materials into the segmented cube and left the rest to Anastasia. Taking Ana's hand, they walked into the center of the bronze-grade village again. It looked much different this time. Rather than a dilapidated hut, it was a somewhat simple hall. Lionel made it to the center and looked at the rotating cube again. There was another reason he forced the upgrade ahead of time, and that was because of the unique property of territory at the bronze grade and above, a territory map. Even Lionel's internal sight was greatly suppressed here. 10 kilometers was about his limit. But this moon had thousands of miles of circumference. It was far too inconvenient. However, a territory map gave you a perfect bird's-eye view. At the bronze grade, this range was 50 kilometers in radius, 5 times that of Lionel's current range. In that instant, all of the challenges and opportunities appeared before Lionel's eyes. It wasn't just the challenges that appeared, but also the people. Lionel's gaze was frighteningly cold. The air wars truly began now. Chapter 1937. Published at 19th of June 2023 10:52 and 52 seconds AM. Chapter 1937. Mine if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Given that the range was just 50 kilometers, there was only 2 other individuals within range. And when Lionel saw who it was, the coldness in his eyes only increased. "They're mine," Lionel said lightly. "Indeed, it is too soon to speak," a sneer came from the side. This individual didn't speak directly to the ancestors of the Morales family. Instead, he only spoke to his own people within an organization known as the Gold Dark Organization. The Gold Dark Organization was an existence that could be considered on par with the Constellation families, or rather ranked amongst the weakest of those 12 families, but far beneath the likes of the Omen, Morales, and Suyard. They weren't often spoken about because they hadn't produced any extremely powerful geniuses since Asena, and they were generally regarded as a power on the decline. Though, this could be said to be mostly an illusion. Rather than saying they hadn't produced a powerful genius in a while, it was rather that they didn't have a participating member of the so-called Cataclysm generation. And the story behind this tied back to that oh-so-familiar name, Asena. Asena was none other than the overseer of Lionel's true selection, and yet another woman with a grudge against his father, and likewise, his mother. The one who had spoken, though, was Asena's husband, a man several times older than she was. It could be said that Asena was tragic in her own way. The only way she could have escaped such a marriage was if she had managed to entice Lionel's father, but in the end her failure to do so sealed her fate. All things considered, her husband was an exceptionally powerful man and among the very few candidates slated to become among the next batch of eighth-dimensional existences, a man who went by Baman. However, he was a jealous man. As such, after Asena's elders co-signed their marriage, Asena was forced to give up pretty much everything. Asena, as a result, was thrust into the role of swollen-foot pregnant wife much earlier than the others of her generation. She was pulled out of the Void Palace under the pretext of a mission and didn't return until after she had given birth twice. Of course, these were against the rules of the Void Palace, but these were sorts of matters that were easily swept under the rug if done cleverly enough. Rearing a child was one matter, but giving birth to them only took a handful of years. The trouble was that Velasco had no care for these rules and couldn't be bothered to circumvent them properly, leading to head-butting with the Void Palace top brass. Due to the fact Asena was forced into such a thing so early on, not only was she resentful as her potential was cut short, but her children didn't quite match the ages of the Cataclysm generation. They were too old to be part of the Cataclysm generation, but too young to be part of her generation. This led to them being relatively obscure, something that left the Gold Dark organization, Bamun and her quite dissatisfied. These air wars were a perfect opportunity, and even better than that, their two sons had landed right within Lionel's range. "Those two brats are decent," Ancestor Mito said with a sneer. If that brat was smart, he would avoid them for as long as possible. But I doubt he'll have a choice like that. The commotion he caused in clearing the bronze grade challenge was far too much. Bamun's gaze blazed. His hatred for Velasco was great. And he knew well that while it seemed like his wife hated him as well, it was a resentment that stemmed from a completely different feeling. Seeing Velasco's son lose to his own would be the ultimate retribution, a sign to Asena that their union had always been the right one. Asena's own gaze blazed with a similar ill intent, almost leaning over the side of their flagship just to get a closer look. It was then that, to everyone's surprise, the moment Lionel glanced at the two on the territory map, he flickered and vanished. Lionel's speed was unconscious. He moved even faster than he had before, his speed making the elders on the outside fall into complete silence. His figure flashed, then flashed again. He crossed the 50-kilometer distance in not even half a minute, booming shrieks of shattering sound barriers echoing out from behind him. At the same time, Aina had made her own move, but rather than moving with Lionel, she had targeted the first challenge within their territory, mapping out the path between three of them before setting off. The pair of Gold Dark brothers had been making their way toward the commotion, cautiously paying attention to their surroundings so that they wouldn't miss any hidden dangers or challenges. However, what neither of them had expected was to run into their first contestant. The two hadn't done much. Since entering, they had only cleared a single challenge and had been biding their time until they sensed Lionel and Aina's upgrade challenge and began to move in this direction. However, the two didn't know what an upgrade challenge would be like just yet, so they had yet to confirm. Plus, it was so early on that they didn't believe that anyone would be undergoing such a challenge already. Before they could tell what was happening, though, someone had already appeared over the horizon. The two instantly recognized Lionel and looked toward one another. The faint excitement and eagerness in their eyes was clear. "He's mine. Fuck off, he's mine." The two didn't get to finish their little song and dance, nor did they have the time to think of why Lionel was alone rather than with his partner. Lionel unleashed a roar, 3 sapphire blue vital star 4 stars appearing to his back as his body erupted with a bronze aura. His halo expanded and descended down the length of his body, revealing a divine armor of jade green and pearly white that exuded a vitality that caused even the cracked and dried grounds in the surroundings to grow rapidly. The final piece of his armor had just clinked into place when he appeared before the two, dense blue nebulae-like fog coming from the vents of his divine armor. All at once, the Morales family ancestors and elders stood to their feet. Sorry for the uber-late chapters everyone, hectic 2 months ahead like I've said previously. Chapter 2 coming ASAP. Chapter 1938. Published at 19th of June 2023 10:52 and 50 seconds AM. Chapter 1938. Gold Dark. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel punched out with the momentum of the world to his back. The Gold Dark brothers reacted instantly, setting aside their disagreement and punching out in unison to meet Lionel's. Their fists never even connected. The sheer pressure of Lionel's punch snapped their wrists and broke their forearms in 3. Pain twisted their features as they were blown backward. Lionel reached out a palm to his side, forming a spear of emulation star force, bronze aura and ethereal star force. The two brothers spiraled through the air, their hearts leaping into their throats. As geniuses of the Void Palace, they made their decision instantly. They had to bring out everything. They roared in unison, their skin beginning to glow with a dark gold glow as a twin pair of dark golden rivers took shape. The manifestation of the gold dark lineage factor roared like snaking dragons, the crashing waves causing the ground to rumble. The two coated their broken arms in a layer of this molten dark gold and landed heavily on the ground at once. They hadn't been able to trade for their weapons after completing just a single challenge. Even so, they quickly formed a saber for each one of them, manipulating their dark gold rivers. Almost the instant they finished, their eyes widened. Despite their fast reactions, Lionel's spear was already before them. They both crossed their sabers across their bodies. Clang! Clang! Their sabers exploded on contact, the integrity of their odd molten force completely unable to hold up. Their arms were flung to the side of their bodies, parried away and completely exposing their chests. With a step, Lionel appeared above them. The two could barely see his eyes through the visor of his armor, but they felt a strong tide of helplessness take hold of their hearts. The tip of Lionel's spear trembled just once and he pierced downward. PCHU. PCHU. Two throats were skewered through. Lionel didn't show the slightest hesitation, not the slightest hint of mercy, not the slightest pause. He had already given his warning. From this moment onward, every contestant that crossed his path would taste his blade. Since they dared to ignore his threat, he would show them the consequences for doing so. He landed on the aura, billowing vital star force jetting out in all directions. A towering pressure exuded from him, one that the human domain would maybe never forget. The first geniuses had fallen so soon. It suddenly dawned on them that this would truly be a bloodbath. No! Asenna shrieked. She nearly flew down from the railing toward the glass cube as though she would be able to enter the air war ground like this. If it wasn't because Bauman caught her and held her back, she may very well have succeeded. However, in return for such a thing, Asenna seemed to have completely lost her mind, lashing out at Bauman with what could only be said to be an intent to kill. She lashed out with everything she had and Bauman's clothing was matted in blood instantly. Although he wasn't anywhere near dead, or even threatened, as an expert deep within the seventh dimension herself, if Asenna wanted to she could definitely cause harm to him. Bauman's expression was already dark, but seeing that Asenna didn't seem to have any intention of stopping anytime soon, he only became gloomier. At that moment, an ancestor of the Gold Dark organization stepped forward, tapping the back of Asenna's neck. Her vision went white and she collapsed, but her shrieks still echoed in the silence. The divine armor. Life grade. The Morales ancestors couldn't take their lives off of it. To put this ridiculous matter into context, the only people in their family that had life-grade divine armors were them. Only ancestors who had stepped into the 8th dimension could possibly have such a thing. The only person who had formed a life-grade divine armor at the 7th dimension was Velasco. He was the one and only anomaly, there had never been another. He was the first and the last. However, Lionel was in the 6th dimension. If others could just forge your divine armor for you, this wouldn't be so surprising. They would all just assume that Velasco had been a madman and forged Lionel's divine armors for him. In that case, what would be impressive wasn't Lionel's skill, but rather the fact that his body could withstand a life-grade divine armor in the first place. However, in order to fuse with a divine armor, one had to have intimate familiarity with it. This was why you had to forge your own divine armor. Even if you could fuse with a supremely powerful divine armor, whether or not you could control it and have the stamina to summon it in the first place was a completely different matter. In truth, Lionel wasn't even aware of this. If he was, he would have known that his father's suggestion to fuse evolution ores into his divine armor was completely insane. That was because all this time, Lionel had to sustain a divine armor a dimensional level above his own. What these ancestors didn't know was that this was only the tip of the iceberg. This was just one of Lionel's 3 divine armors, and it also happened to be the weakest one by no small measure. Even so, They were so shocked by the divine armor that they didn't even take notice of the 3 blue stars until several moments later. Those stars, why do I sense the aura of the heavenly body realm? This brat sure has a lot of secrets. Before they could discuss any more, the agitation of the crowd couldn't seem to be held back any longer. The Morales family is too vicious. Ancestor Goldark said slowly, but with power. Alvaro and the others turned over with a sneer, but before they could say anything, Lionel's voice echoed. The atmosphere froze. How didn't Lionel's voice reach them so clearly through so many layers of dream force? Ancestor Hito, who was resting his eyes by the side, suddenly sat up, his wrinkles smoothing out as his eyes brightened. However many come is as many as you will lose. Chapter 1939. Published at 19th of June 2023 10:50 and 51 seconds AM. Chapter 1939. Final challenge: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel seemed to stare into each one of their souls as he spoke. His eyes were almost entirely invisible beneath his visor, and yet just as piercing. The Morales might have been the first to notice, but one after another, the sharp senses of the other ancestors caught up and they also realized that Lionel was, in fact, wearing a life-grade divine armor. Their pupils constricted one by one, their hearts freezing over. He wasn't just as monstrous as his father, he was a step beyond. No matter how big of a fuss the 4 great families made over bloodlines, it was simply impossible to guarantee the talent of an offspring. More often, what was important was having a large pool of descendants with a similar concentration of blood. By maximizing the number of such individuals, you would always be bound to have talented disciples. This was why, despite the fact Nana wasn't from a strong family branch of the Aderna, she was still given the treatment of one of their supreme geniuses. Even those families had a limit to their nepotism and disdain for those of lower stature, although said limit didn't extend beyond those with the same eye and hair color as them. This was all to say that the power of the parents didn't always guarantee the power of the child. Although there was a correlation, the more powerful the parent, the less likely the child would be able to reach their level even when given sufficient time and more than enough resources. If such a thing was guaranteed, who would have dared to look down on Lionel? They would have all treated him like a little monster they needed to veer away from. However, not only was this unlikely, Lionel's mother was an unknown variable that could very easily result in a lower bloodline overall. There was also one more matter, the key to all of this. The Velasco line had already produced 3 such geniuses in quick succession. Although Montez was considered to be a tier below Velasco and Cynthia, he was still someone that wasn't to be trifled with. Then there was Velasco himself, and more importantly, the father of the 2 of them. The odds that this would continue and produce another genius in Lionel should have been next to 0. Every family line went through peaks and troughs, one could just indefinitely extend into infinity. And yet, that seemed to be exactly what had happened here. They had made a mistake. Lionel flicked his wrist, dispersing his spear and allowing his divine armor to sink into his body. He looked down at the 2 corpses before him and his gaze flickered. With a swipe of his hand, he stored the 2 kills they represented but didn't use them immediately. He seemed to have other thoughts in mind. In addition, he gained an additional 1,000 points. Unlike the spear domain tribulation, after kills in the air wars, Lionel gained the points or progress of his fallen enemies in this regard. These 1,000 points should have been from the challenge that the 2 had cleared, but they had stored it rather than using it on anything. Lionel assumed that many who entered without a plan would make this sort of choice, but in his eyes, it was the epitome of foolishness. It was akin to sealing away hard cash in a safe in your basement rather than properly investing it. As the air wars continued, the value of your points would only continue to plummet. The only thing that would maintain the same value were kill exchanges. The points you had now would never be worth as much again, so hoarding them, waiting for some perfect pie in the sky moment was nothing short of foolish. After this, Lionel shot back toward the bronze-grade village. He had already memorized the map and knew where all the challenges were, so returning wasn't a pressing need, or so many thoughts. But he had his own reasons. Lionel immediately swapped in the 1,000 points he had just gained for more raw materials and tossed them all to Anastasia. At that moment, Aina had displayed her own speed, already returning with 3 challenges completed. She appeared before Lionel in a flicker and began speaking without delay. 2 challenges were a simple battle with a bronze-grade threat, both gave 1,000 points each, 10 times more than what you would receive for battling them in the wild and killing them there. However, they don't count for a kill, so they can't be used to exchange for subordinates. Lionel nodded and let Aina continue. The final challenge was a city upgrade challenge. It allows us to double the size of our territory and gain silver-grade walls without upgrading to the silver grade first. I didn't challenge it because it would take me too long to finish on my own, not worth it unless we do it together. Lionel nodded again. Then, he took the 2,000 points Aina had come with and exchanged them for yet more raw materials. Let's go, that's a worthwhile challenge. Aina was already moving. Lionel swiftly appeared by her side, the two shooting through their territory with great speed. Soon, up ahead, the two saw a floating glass orb. Within it, there was a floating wall of what looked like concrete, a silver-grade upgrade. However, it was likewise a silver-grade difficulty challenge. Without hesitation, the two entered together, appearing before a village with silver-grade walls but bronze-grade threats. With a tacit understanding, Lionel leapt into the air and brandished his bow while Aina rushed forward with the axe he had created for her out of emulation spatial force. They both took a deep breath at the same time and suddenly roared, a heavenly resonance of force forming between the two. Lionel's gaze sharpened as he pulled his bowstring back. One arrow to connect the earth and skies. He released, a streaking heat piercing down and leaving a blinding pillar of golden light in its wake. Chapter 1940. Published at 19th of June 2023 10:50 and 50 seconds AM. Chapter 1940, well-oiled. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel and Aina swiftly swept through the challenge once the gates collapsed. Although they didn't gain any kill exchanges, the value of the rewards weren't to be scoffed out. Having silver-grade walls ahead of time meant that they could access wall upgrade ahead of time, which meant they could form a half-step gold-grade wall before even facing the silver-grade upgrade challenge. But to Lionel, this was less important than the doubling in territory size. Although it was said to be double, mathematically, it was much more than that. Increasing the radius of their territory from 50 kilometers to 100 kilometers meant that so much more would be within range. The two split up. Lionel returned to the village to use the upgrades they had gained while Aina had set her sights on the last 3 challenges that were within their current territories. Upon returning, Lionel used the upgrades. The village wands expanded, grew taller and much thicker. At the same time, they changed from mud walls to walls built with thick cement blocks, rising to just over 10 meters in height. Lionel began to go through the upgrades one by one, adjusting his calculations. His pupils flickered back and forth and he went through an obscene amount of information in just a few seconds. Unfortunately, not all of the rules of the air wars were known in full detail ahead of time. Well, the rules themselves were, but some small details like these and upgrades weren't hashed out ahead of time, otherwise Lionel would have long memorized them and not even wasted time. Most valuable upgrades are double height, double thickness, and the addition of the moat. Of these, the moat is most important because this region has no water whatsoever and the land is especially dry. It's also very flat and doesn't have many terrain advantages. One might wonder why Lionel was worrying about water. At this stage, he could last months even without food, water or sleep, normally, anyway. Unfortunately, much like how he felt the need to sleep regularly in the Cataclysm Zone, this region had an added suppression that forced others into a similar state. Soon, food and the like would become necessary. For now, the speed of choosing a barren land trumped the future potential troubles that it could bring. However, this wouldn't last forever, so Lionel was already thinking of methods to deal with the issue. And, as he had deduced, because of the gamified nature of the air wars, there would be plenty of methods of dealing with this. The total needed for these upgrades is about 20,000. Plus what we'll need for the silver grade upgrade, and that places our needs at around 70,000 points right now. There's no easy way to gather that quickly. We'll have to change our strategy after clearing out the region and look for some dungeons or bosses. If we're lucky. Silver grade challenges were rare at the start of the Air Wars. The only way to get them to appear and thus gain more points per challenge was to upgrade to a silver grade territory, or to explore the wilderness and hope you stumbled across one by luck. Lionel wouldn't waste time on the second, and the first was obviously out of reach due to the lack of points for a silver grade upgrade to begin with. So, everything came full circle. Lionel shifted his attention from the upgrade list and scanned the new territory map. Excellent. With a flicker, Lionel vanished and used the same strategy as Aina. He picked out 3 challenges and carved out a path between them. He would start with the simple ones first and leave the more complex ones to last. If the more complex challenges could be completed quickly by him alone, he would move forward and do so. If it required the 2 of them, he would return to the territory and work together with Aina to clear the challenge. If the both of them ran into such a challenge, they would clear both before rinsing and repeating. The silence in the human domain while watching this scene was palpable. Lionel and Aina's movements weren't even the most entertaining, but they were so precise and well-oiled that it was suffocating in its own right. In just half a day, the 2 had cleared 24 challenges while the next closest group didn't even have a dozen despite the fact many were working in groups larger than just a pair by now. Lionel and Aina were supposedly the weakest, they were in the smallest group, and yet they were leagues beyond. After all the challenges in their territory were cleared, Lionel and Aina gained 22,000 points and several other rewards. The many rewards were mostly related to territory upgrades, including irrigation systems, farms, carefully bred animals and the like. Lionel's favorite, however, were the 3 outposts they had gained. Outposts could be placed on the outskirts of their territory and they gain an additional 10 kilometers of range to their territory map. Lionel planted 2 and took the 3rd with him as he and Aina headed toward the final challenge within their territory. As for the points, rather than using it on the village, Lionel used 10,000 to trade for Aina's battle axe and another 10,000 to trade for the white lion bow, and finally the remaining 2,000 points on more raw materials. The members of the Constellation Bow Alliance could only seethe when they saw this. There was nothing they could do. Ancestor Mito's gaze turned malevolent, but he calmed himself. Soon, the bow would return to where it was meant to be. Now that he had brought it out and set such a challenge, it was only a matter of time. Nearby the dungeon Lionel and Aina were headed toward, 3 members of the Constellation Bow Alliance had already appeared and scouted out before preparing to return with the information to the main group. But how could Lionel not know what was happening within his own territory? Chapter 1941. Published at 28th of June 2023 1:08 and 25 seconds p.m. Chapter 1941. Long lost. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel and Aina's appearance caught the attention of the 3 archers almost instantly. As bowmen, it wasn't a surprise that they had sharp vision. However, what they didn't know was that compared to Lionel, their sight wasn't worth much at all. Although Lionel hadn't magically gained the Bao domain lineage factor after becoming a Bao sovereign, as the 2 existences seemed to be separate, the bits and pieces of it that he did have were perfectly intact, and his deeper comprehension of Bao force seemed to have a positive impact on them. Since he knew their location, he had maintained an eye on them from the moment he and Aina left their village for the final time. The eyes of the 3 narrowed. They were only scouts of the Constellation Bow Alliance. Their only job was to scout the region and find challenges. If they could be cleared, they would do so and return with the rewards. If they couldn't be cleared, they would return with a report. Given that this was a dungeon, it had to be reported no matter what. It was of the silver grade and had a 4-person entry specification, but they only had 3. They were supposed to mimic the zones a real territory would have to deal with in real life, albeit more streamlined and less involved. The 3 looked toward one another and seemed to make the decision at the same time. There was no other choice. The moment they saw the white lion bow in Lionel's hands, there was always only a single choice. However, they didn't seem to have realized that the choice was never theirs to begin with. Aina seemed to flicker and vanished. All three reacted extremely quickly, pulling out their bows. However, maybe the greatest weakness for the archers in the air wars was that they couldn't bring their normal set of arrows with them. They had no choice but to use force in place of them. What they hadn't expected, though, was for their bow force to suddenly stop responding to them at all. They pulled their bowstrings back, ready to attack, only to realize that absolutely nothing appeared. Their bow force fizzled out like the last fumes of a dying flame. They were so shocked that they almost couldn't react in time to Aina appearing in their midst, swinging her battle axe with the moment of a dying sun. Crimson force blazed, their blood boiled out of their control, and fear took hold of their throats. All three of them placed their bows out in an attempt to block, but Aina with her battle axe seemed to be on an entirely different level. Whether it was their bows or their bodies, they didn't last even a single strike. All three of them found their bodies severed at the waist, their eyes still widened in shock even as they dimmed. Lionel appeared to Aina's side, looking down coldly. Trying to use bow force in his presence? Wasn't that too foolish? With a thought, Lionel planted the third outpost 10 kilometers out from the dungeon and returned swiftly. After this, he placed a hand over the three and extracted their souls just like he had for every other. But rather than using them, he simply stored them without the intent to use them. After a moment, 3 kill exchanges appeared in the form of 3 red orbs. This time, Lionel didn't ignore them and immediately used all 3. James, Emna and Alan appeared. Even after landing, the 3 didn't say anything, waiting for Lionel's orders. Alan, this is yours. Lionel brought forward a rail gun, an enormous one with a barrel that must have been at least 3 meters long. However, any engineer who had ever seen such a thing would notice the decided lack of engineering. In fact, it was overly simple, but that was because it could be. The magnetic ability index that would make it run would all come from Alan. There's an output 10 kilometers from here in that direction. It has the ability to sense anything within 10 kilometers of it. Any enemy that appears is yours to handle. Alan looked down at the rail gun. It looked under-engineered, but the number of force arts backed into it that could help his accuracy and sight were mind-numbing. He was the only one of Lionel's brothers who had followed the Force Crafter's path, so he knew well what he was seeing. "Leave it to me," Alan said lightly, accepting another small device from Lionel. He raised one hand and the rail gun raised into the air under a mysterious magnetic force. With a jump, he landed on the enormous mechanism's back and shot into the distance with wind-tearing speed. Lionel nodded and turned toward James and Emna. "The two of you head out." Lionel tossed a pair of devices toward the two. The segmented cube hadn't been working all this time for nothing. "Clear as many challenges as you can, kill as many as you can. If you find any other territories in the surroundings aside from in that direction, report it back to me." The direction Lionel pointed to was the direction Alan had gone in. That was the direction he speculated the 3 Constellation Bow Alliance members had come from, and that should be where the rest of the number lied. It wasn't that Lionel was scared Emna and James couldn't deal with them, it was instead a waste of resources because he alone was enough. Emna nodded, working alone was what she did best. As for James, he too had gotten used to lone missions. At the same time, these two were among the 2 strongest under Lionel's charge. He could trust them to protect themselves and work alone. In addition, Emna and James were 2 who didn't need weapons to be exchanged for them. Emna's weapon was her body, and James had always relied on his energy shield ability index. They were the perfect 2 to bring out first. After a short exchange, Emna and James picked 2 different directions and rushed off. Lionel looked toward Aina and nodded. The 2 rushed into the dungeon together. From start to finish, the exchange had taken not even a single minute. Even now, as he pulled the distance between himself and others further and further, Lionel didn't have the time to waste. Well, there was one small moment of time wasted, and that was when he looked up into the skies with a cold glint in his eyes. He didn't need to say it again as his previous words were only continuously echoing in their ears by now. The constellation Biyao Alliance ancestors had all stood to their feet, their fists clenched and their hearts stuck in their throats. If they had denied it before, there was no denying it now. They had hoped it to be a trick of the eye, a combination of Biyao force and light force, maybe the influence of the spear domain ring, but now there was nothing before them and the truth. How? How did Lionel have access to that level of Biyao force? That long-lost Biyao force? That Biyao force no human had had access to since the loss of the Biyao domain ring? Chapter 1942. Published at 28th of June 2023 1:07 and 48 seconds p.m. Chapter 1942, Earth Dragon. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel and Aina sped into the dungeon. Dark cave walls loomed over them and an almost suffocating stench of earth filled their nostrils. The dampness and humidity made it difficult to breathe, the ventilation of the dungeon not seeming great at all. Lionel could immediately tell that their target weren't humans, however he didn't seem capable of pinpointing the exact race either, something that made him narrow his eyes. It seemed that Ancestor Hito had gone out of his way to pick more obscure targets just for the sake of maintaining the usual randomness associated with zones. First there were the trolls they had faced earlier while claiming the village, now this. Thick earthy smell, high humidity, low visibility. Lionel thought of several possibilities before he narrowed it down to one. 76% possibility this is an earth dragon den. Earth dragon, while was the official name of this species, wasn't to be taken literally. Most accurately, they were a type of earth affinity centipede with the legendary ferociousness of dragons, and they were notoriously difficult to handle. They were adept at causing land fissures and earthquakes. They could easily collapse a cave of this caliber, and they could chew through most metals as though they were nothing but thin films of paper. In addition to this, they could hold their breath for weeks at a time even as newborns, and their body temperatures ran so hot that their roars gave off the illusion of fire breath. In reality, though, it was just that their digestive system was so powerful after countless evolution cycles of burrowing through the earth that if they opened their mouths up to the world, everything in their path would be scorched. The good news was that Lionel had an excellent earth force affinity that could somewhat counter these beasts. The bad news, however, was that their breath had nothing to do with fire force despite the heat, making it difficult for him to counter unless he had some sort of cooling measure. Of course, Lionel would still be resistant to the heat itself, but there was little he could do from an actual preventative standpoint. In addition, even his earth force affinity might not prove to be as beneficial as one might hope because the earth dragons were less focused on manipulating earth as opposed to devouring it. Earth dragons, Lionel said lightly. Aina didn't need any more explanations after this. While it had seemed that the two had been in here for a long while already, the reality was that they had only taken a single step. Before their second steps even landed, Lionel had already spoken his conclusion. His mind was simply that fast. In response, their roles shifted. Rather than taking the vanguard, Aina fell back and allowed Lionel to cross in front of her. She strapped her battle axe to her back and took out a twin pair of silk cloths that danced up her wrists and forearms as though they had minds of their own. At the same time, two gourds she had had by her waist opened up and large amounts of blood began to pool out from her sides. At the same time, Lionel's body glowed with an earthly, menacing air. A 3-meter-tall panda construct took form around him, but just as quickly as it appeared, a divine armor appeared and slid into place. By the time Lionel had taken his fifth step into the cave, an enormous 3-headed, 6-armed, armor-covered behemoth had begun to stomp forward. Lionel's new comprehensions in Earth Force hadn't just come with mental changes, they also manifested physically. For example, he could now use his dark gold panda construct and his divine armors at the same time. Earth Force was an extension of his life. His panda construct was just as much a part of his as his divine armors were. Why did they have to be used separately? Lionel unleashed a roar as his 3 vital stars appeared to his back. Aina was completely obscured, but that was exactly the point. He stomped down on the ground once and the earth trembled. The earth dragons had yet to be alerted as they had hardly moved very far into the cave. In fact, it was only now that the entrance vanished behind them, locking them into seeing this dungeon all the way through. But before that, the two took the initiative. Lionel's 6 arms punched into the ground beneath him, roaring as he lifted as though he wouldn't be satisfied until the whole world was above his head. However, it very quickly became obvious that this wasn't a piece of earth at all, and what Lionel had grabbed was actually the head of an enormous beast that must have been at least 20 meters long. Even so, Aina didn't seem surprised. She reacted just as quickly, the twin silk cloths on her wrists suddenly becoming coated by blood as she launched them both forward. The head of the earth dragon was pierced through and its blood was quickly drained. Lionel tossed it to the side and charged forward. He punched walls, ceiling, and the ground. Every time he did, he ripped out another earth dragon, stunning them into place while Aina finished the job. Despite the fact that this wasn't the normal mode of their teamwork, their efficiency was no less great. With a combination of his earth force affinity and sensory abilities, Lionel was able to find the earth dragon before they could launch their usual sneak attacks. At the same time, he clamped their mouths shut, stopping them from using their strongest ability while also crushing the antennas that worked as their sensory organs. When that was done, it was child's play for Aina to sever their lives, and it only got easier and easier as she accumulated more and more of their powerful blood. They tore through the levels of the dungeon and eventually reached the final ground floor. Steam billowed toward their faces, the sheer heat making what should have been the hard ground around them feeling gooey and soft to the touch. Every step they took left another sizzle as an earth dragon that must have been at least 50 meters tall snaked into the air, its hundreds of legs shimmering like steel blades. Chapter 1943. Published at 28th of June 2023 1:07 and 28 seconds p.m. Chapter 1943. 3. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again PCHU. Lionel roared, grabbing 2 sides of a large wound Aina had caused in the boss earth dragon's head with all 6 hands. Vital star force rushed out from his divine armor as he flexed, pulling with all the force he could muster. Blood and bone flew as the earth dragon was torn in 2 from head to tail. Bang! Lionel landed heavily on the almost molten ground, exhaling a breath with a sharp and cold gaze. He dispersed his panda construct in his divine armor, his breath turbid and steaming. Aina appeared by his side and he placed a hand on her shoulder, causing a bubble of cool air to descend and envelop her. The steam increased, but Lionel had already moved forward, reaching the final altar of the dungeon and waving a hand. Lionel waved another hand, accepting the rewards. For a dungeon like this one, a perfect clear condition would probably relate to clearing all of the earth dragons in addition to finishing within a certain time. This was a silver grade dungeon, so although the clear reward was air grade, it probably wouldn't be too exaggerated. The reward was twofold. The first was the point reward, which was 270,000 points. The second reward was a one-time use item that came in the form of a glass orb with the phantom of an earth dragon within it. From Lionel's understanding, it was a terrain shift reward. He could change one thing about the landscape of his territory within certain limits. He did a few calculations in his head when he saw this, comparing and contrasting his ideas with the limitations stipulated in the fine print. After a moment, he nodded to himself. It was feasible, though only in part. What was more important, though, was the added effect that came with implementing this change in the first place. The shaking of the earth that supplemented the change could be both a negative and a positive depending on how it was used. Lionel thought of some possibilities before storing it away. With a nod toward Aina, the two left the dungeon together. "Where is it, Alvaro? Explain yourself." The fury of the constellation Biyao Alliance ancestors seemed to have reached a fever pitch. The only conclusion they could come to after all this time was that the Morales family had somehow gotten their hands on the Biyao domain ring. Nothing else seemed to make sense to them. They had never heard of the so-called sovereign moniker, at least not in regards to weapons. This was a relatively new concept that had only been introduced by some who had heard of it in the Cataclysm Zone. This conclusion seemed to make sense to them as well. Velasco spent a lot of time venturing outside of the human domain. If there was anyone who could reclaim that treasure under their noses, it was him. And if he had done so, who else would he give it to if not Lionel? Wouldn't that also explain why the white lion Bao had never followed any one of them but so obediently followed Lionel? The truth was that the Bao didn't listen even to Lionel's mother. She had given Lionel the Bao hoping that it would acknowledge him in the future, and it was a surprise to her that it did so immediately. If even Eleanor, who probably believed in Lionel the most of anyone in existence, was so surprised, how could the Constellation Bao Alliance possibly accept it with open hearts? In the moment, it felt like they had finally gained an explanation for something that had been tearing into their souls for the longest time. The Morales ancestors frowned, not quite knowing what Ancestor Mito and the others were even referring to. It seemed that every action Lionel took only increased the tensions in the surroundings further. First Ancestor Goldark accused them of being far too ruthless, and now Ancestor Mito and the others of the Constellation Bao Alliance were up in arms. Don't pretend to be ignorant. The Bao domain ring. Where is it? The eyes of the Morales ancestors flashed. Was this what they were talking about? They put together the vanishing Bao force and the golden Bao force. Lionel used and understood why they had reached such a conclusion. But the result of them comprehending this was them bursting into a fit of laughter. It was uproarious, arrogant, and filled with complete disregard and unfeeling, uncaring derision. Ancestor Mito was so furious that steam truly began to come out of the top of his head. One would have thought that this was a ridiculous exaggeration of an old-school cartoon, however the bodies of such experts could react with just as much exaggeration. When an eighth-dimensional existence was enraged, the environment had no choice but to react. Let me ask you something, Mito, Alvaro's voice boomed. Even if the Morales family had gotten its hands on the Bao domain ring, what would it have to do with your alliance? The booming shockwave of Alvaro's voice drowned out the voices of rage, his own malevolent expression seemingly not losing out in the slightest. It seemed that he wanted to slaughter the Constellation Bao Alliance members even more than they wanted to lay hands on him. There was nothing he abhorred more than hypocrites, and he hated weak hypocrites even more. If you were going to be hypocritical, the least you could do was not be on your hands and knees asking for handouts while you did so. Your families lost the Bao domain ring to the spirituals all those years ago, causing the human domain to drastically weaken. Your Terrius family went from a top dog to a piece of trash with no other choice but to form an alliance in hopes of maintaining your former prestige. Now you want to come and bark in front of me? Tell you what, if you dare to take 3 spear strikes from me right this moment, I might dignify your question with an answer. Chapter 1944. Published at 28th of June 2023 1:07 and 24 seconds p.m. Chapter 1944. Kill if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Ancestor Mito was so enraged by these words that his palm flipped over to reveal a shimmering black Bao. But at the same moment that he acted, Alvaro had likewise taken out his bronze spear. It looked as though this was what the latter had wanted from the very beginning. Why did those little brats get to have all the fun? He wanted to let the world see his sharpness too. Everyone, let's calm down. An ancestor by Mito's side pressed down his hand before he could raise his Bao and take a step of no return. This isn't what today is about. Let the kids handle this matter. Alvaro snorted. Pretentious pricks. If they didn't feel the fire in their bellies anymore, they could just say so and off themselves. What good was pretending to be high and above it all when all it did was dull your blade? There was a reason the Morales were the strongest, and there was a reason it would stay that way. Lionel and Aina exited the cave. There was an immediate choice to be made. They had enough for a promotion to silver grade now, but there was a threat to their side, and it wouldn't be long before they realized that 3 of their own had died. This should have been a difficult choice to make, but Lionel didn't seem to pause his steps for even a moment as he shot in the direction of the village. Boom! 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 Despite the loud booms to his back, Lionel still didn't turn back, continuing to run in the opposite direction with Aina. He had left that matter to Alan, and he had already calculated that Alan would be able to hold on. When this matter was concluded, their advantage would only increase further. Alan stood at the top of the outpost, his eyes sharp beneath his glasses. He held up the massive rail gun, his eyes locking onto a group in the distance as he unleashed another barrage. Before the shot even landed, his muscles flexed and his hips pivoted, swinging the railgun in a completely different direction as he unleashed another barrage. No one could seem to enter within a 10-kilometer radius of this region without being blasted to smithereens. Most managed to dodge and save their own lives, however the first few had been greatly unlucky, losing their lives almost instantly. Lionel checked his kill exchange counter. After almost 2 hours, it had climbed to 11. This couldn't be considered too great or too small. The moment he and Aina made it back to the village, as they rushed into the central console room, Lionel began to exchange for more people. He brought out his 7 remaining brothers, in addition to Elther, Sale, Raylion and Hephaestus. When they appeared, everyone already seemed to know what they needed to do. They rushed to the walls just as Lionel exchanged 20,000 points to complete the improvement to silver grade that he had wanted. After the moat was formed, Lionel exchanged 50,000 more points and triggered the silver grade upgrade sequence. He and Aina, likewise, rushed to their positions on the wall, their gazes cold. "This brat continues to overestimate himself," Mito spat coldly. His temper was only becoming more and more frayed as he watched a single Alan hold back the young geniuses of his Constellation Biyao alliance. The only thing that gave him some reprieve was the fact there was no way he would be able to hold out for long. Soon, very soon, Nazag would be alerted to this matter and this farce would end. At the same time, this Lionel would likely bury himself under his own foolishness. There was a reason there was such a large leap in price between the bronze grade and silver grade upgrade challenges. One was supposed to have a large group of subordinates out by now, at least a few hundred. As time went on, more wild challenges were supposed to spawn, and barbarians of sorts would begin to appear in the wild, making accumulating kills and gathering more subordinates far easier. Right now, they were just at the beginning of heirs claiming their first territories. Lionel was the only one with a bronze grade territory in the first place. Being greedy and trying to push for a silver grade now was the epitome of foolishness. There were only 121 in the bronze grade wave, but there would easily be 100 times that in the silver grade wave, on top of the fact they would all be silver grade threats as opposed to bronze grade threats. Lionel had already sent away his most powerful combatants. His most powerful ranged specialist was tied down by the Constellation Biyao alliance. And now he was going to try and challenge a wave of thousands with just over a dozen. If this wasn't foolish, what was? Silver grade walls weren't nearly enough to offset this kind of danger. However, this wave would leave nothing more than silence. Lionel stood on the walls as the ground began to quake. Large dust clouds appeared in the distance as the sparse trees began to fall one after another. However, Lionel only calmly held his bow before him, not making a single move just yet. His gaze was the picture of perfect calmness, his hair swaying ever so gently in the wind. Menacing creatures appeared in the surroundings. They wrapped around the city, hooting and hollering, their weapons clanging. 3. The rumbling ground threatened to split as it whined and gave way. 2. Lionel could see the faces of the front line clearly. Even if he had been in the third dimension, he would have been able to. Those menacing tusks, that dripping saliva, those blood-caked machetes. 1. Lionel tapped his waist, bringing out a small orb with a writhing earth dragon within. 0. He dropped it to the ground. The moment it collided, everything seemed to change. The city, which had been on perfectly flat ground, began to rise up. The jagged edges of a mountainous region began to take shape, the water of the moat spilling over. The ground quaked and split. What had once been the intimidation of the enemy became their nightmare. Some fell within fissures, others were crushed by falling rock, and yet others found themselves wading in waves of water coming from a moat that seemed much too deep for common sense. At that moment, Lionel took out 3 more orbs. These were none other than the 3 irrigation rewards he and Aina had gained clearing challenges. As their village rose on the back of a growing mountain, lines of rivers began to appear, flooding the region with more and more water. The creatures that weren't crushed by rocks suddenly found themselves being drowned one after another. The result was absolutely devastating. By the time Lionel and the others stopped rising into the air, the army of thousands had been reduced to a few hundred. "Kill," Lionel said lightly, raising his bow. Silence fell over the human domain once more. There was nothing to be said, nothing that could be said. It was a sweeping victory. Lionel, however, didn't seem to care very much. The next order of business. Crushing the Constellation Bao Alliance. Chapter 1945. Published at 28th of June 2023 1:07 and 23 seconds p.m. Chapter 1945. 10,000 If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The now silver-grade village sat atop of a mountain, hidden deep within its sharp canopies. This mountain wasn't of exaggerated size. This made sense considering it was a reward from a silver-grade dungeon, although it was granted as the highest level prize. As such, the mountain itself was only about 500 meters tall at its greatest point, which was relatively short even for a third-dimensional world. Even so, it had become a nightmare to attack. The pathways of the mountain were a combination of crisscrossing rivers and narrow walkways. Attack in large numbers was almost impossible. It was probably easier to just try to raise the mountain to the ground first, but even getting into position to do so was a nightmare as well. Because Lionel had activated the Earth Dragon dungeon reward before the trial was completed, there was the added benefit of the silver-grade walls being reconstructed with the new terrain in mind. This might seem like a small matter, but now there was a wall that snaked around even the unpredictable terrain of the mountain, and around there was a much deeper and thicker moat. The village had become a beacon in all directions, making their location clear and obvious. But at the same time, it became a region that was near impossible to actually attack. Lionel descended from the walls and waved a hand. In this challenge, they had 138 kill exchanges. Without hesitation, he used 10,000 of them. Then, he traded in the remaining 37 silver-grade kills for 3,137,000 points, as every silver-grade kill was worth 1,000 points. The gold-grade upgrade would require 500 million points to trigger, so they were still an enormous distance away. However, these 3 million or so points, added with the 200,000 points he had yet to use, weren't entirely useless either. Much like Lionel had been able to upgrade the walls after they reached the silver grade, he could now pay to upgrade other facets of the city now that it was also in the silver grade. After pouring another 50,000 or so points into the segmented cube to give it more raw materials, Lionel began to buy the upgrades he had had his eye on. By now, he had already cleared away all of the raw materials he had bought ahead of time and could outfit everyone with what they needed given another half day or so. As for the upgrades, he focused on two main things: more outposts and larger territory. After reaching the silver grade, the range of the city went from a radius of 50 kilometers to 100 kilometers. Lionel doubled that for 500,000 points, then doubled it again for 1,000,000 points, giving them a 400 kilometers, which was already a 100 away from the range of a gold-grade city, which was probably why he wasn't allowed to double it again. Finally, he bought the highest grade outposts that he could, spending the rest of the over 1.5 million swiftly. Each cost about 100,000 points each. He bought 16 and dotted them around the territory. The difference between the 50,000 point model and the 100,000 point model was nothing on paper. However, in the fine print, it made it clear that the highest upgrade was linked with the city. Meaning, when the city entered the gold grade, so would they. This would allow teleportation function between the outposts, making the doubled price more than worth it. Of course, for most others, they wouldn't be able to swallow this cost so early on, and by the time they could, they wouldn't want to lag behind and waste time accumulating more points just to have upgradable outposts. Lights began to flash, and one after another, thousands of Lionel's warriors began to appear. Very quickly, it became obvious that not a single one of them was human. They were the Oryx. Much like everyone else, the moment the Oryx appeared, they were perfectly organized. They didn't say anything, they didn't waste time looking around, they simply filed themselves in an orderly line and waited as Lionel handed them their equipment one by one. Even with the sheer number of them, in just a single hour, they were already finished. Each oryx was outfitted with their weapon and armor, shimmering with a black luster beneath the slowly setting sun. The more the elders on the outside saw, the more sure they were. Lionel had truly planned everything out from the very beginning, he had never left a single thing to chance, and his people were just as prepared as he was. Watching him as he steadily pulled away, the sullenness of the others only became more and more obvious. Lionel waved a hand and motes of force arts formed in the skies, snaking around until they formed a roaring violet-scaled dragon that soared into the skies. By his side, there was no one else but Aina, the only one worthy of standing by his side. On the ground below, Elthar stood at the helm of the Oryx army, a massive black saber resting menacingly on his shoulder. Lionel's brothers and the others stood on the city walls. They wouldn't be participating in this expedition, the city had reached a point where it needed others to stay back and protect it now. However, they didn't seem worried in the slightest, and why would they be? Lionel strapped the white lion bow to his back. We move. The silence of the human domain was heavy. It felt like Lionel wasn't marching toward the Constellation Bow Alliance, but rather toward them, their own homes, their worlds, ready to snatch their hearts. Looking toward the cobbled-together resistance of the Constellation's Bow Alliance, the hearts of Ancestor Mito and the others sank. Lionel had gone from having the fewest subordinates present, to suddenly having the most by far. What chance did they even stand? Ancestor Mito gripped the railings of his flagship, twisting the tough metal as though it was made of thin aluminum. Nazag. We can only rely on you. You're tuning into the Biyao's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.